straight like that.
Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Today we're reading from Standoff, How America Became Ungovernable by Bill Schneider. This is from the first chapter, titled Old America versus New America. On November 8th, 2016, American voters did an astonishing thing. They elected a president of the United States who most voters, 61%, did not think was qualified to serve as president. How did that happen? How did we get from John F. Kennedy to Donald J. Trump? A little more than 50 years ago, the United States started on a great political journey in two opposite directions, part of the country to the right and part of the country to the left. This is the story of where we are now and how we got here. It's the story of the country's journey and my own personal journey as I covered it. It's the story of two political movements that first emerged in the 1960s. The New America is the progressive coalition of groups whose political consciousness was stirred in that decade. African Americans, young people, working people, gays, immigrants, educated professionals, and the non-religious. What holds that coalition together is a commitment to diversity and inclusion, and that commitment provoked a fierce backlash in 2016. In fact, a conservative backlash has defied the New America for more than 50 years. The backlash came from the old America, mostly white, mostly male, mostly older, mostly conservative, mostly religious, and mostly non-urban. In 2016, the old America rallied to the theme, Make America Great Again. It was a call to restore the America they feared was being swept away by a tide of political correctness. The two moments collided under President Barack Obama. Within weeks of Obama's inauguration on January 20th, 2009, a right-wing opposition movement broke out in the form of the Tea Party. Republicans rode that anger to power in Congress, gaining control of the House of Representatives in 2010 and the Senate in 2014. Within one day of Trump's inauguration, a backlash broke out on the left, with a massive spontaneous women's march in Washington that drew throngs of supporters in cities across the United States. Using the Tea Party as a model, Democrats hope to ride anger on the left to power. The right and the left started their journeys at the same place, 38%. That's the vote that Barry Goldwater got in 1964 and that George McGovern got in 1972. The Republican presidential vote peaked with Richard Nixon in 72 at 61% and Ronald Reagan in 84 at 59%. The Democratic presidential vote rose to a bare majority with Jimmy Carter in 76, 50.1%, and then took 32 years to reach a majority again, whereupon the new backlash quickly set in on the right. As of 2017, the Democratic Party had less clout in national and state governments than at any time since 1928. Things started out pretty bad for Democrats. In 1972, a Democratic operative recounted the story of how George McGovern's campaign manager had called the Democratic congressional candidate in Ohio. "I have wonderful news for you," the campaign manager said. "Senator McGovern is coming to campaign in your district." "That is good news," the local candidate responded, "but I'm afraid I'm going to be in Florida visiting my mother." Wait a minute, McGovern's campaign manager said. I haven't told you when he's coming. It doesn't matter, the Democratic candidate replied. Whenever he shows up, I'll be in Florida visiting my mother. Democrats were forced to accommodate to the new conservative ascendancy. Bill Clinton, who fashioned himself a new Democrat and a proponent of the third way, got elected in '92 with 43% of the vote. The presidential vote was split three ways that year, with independent Ross Perot receiving 19%. Clinton's coattails were unimpressive. Democrats lost seats in the House of Representatives in '92. It was the first election following a census and redistricting. Redistricting always puts incumbents, mostly Democrats in '92, at a disadvantage because they're forced to compete in an unfamiliar electorate. The contours of Clinton's '92 victory were different from anything Democrats had won with before. Democrats may have nominated two Southern white Baptists for president and vice president in 1992, but the Clinton-Al Gore ticket fared worse in the South. It was the only region in the country where George H.W. Bush led Clinton by 2 points. Among whites born in the South, the base of the pre-1960s Democratic coalition, Bush ran 19 points ahead of Clinton. Clinton's vote, weakest in the South and strongest in the East and West Coast, did not look like the Democratic votes that had elected Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy and Jimmy Carter. It resembled the votes the Democrats got when they nominated liberals such as George McGovern in '72 and Michael Dukakis in '88. That's why '92 was a breakthrough for Democrats. It was the first time they won with a vote that looked like the new America, but it was still not a majority. Clinton narrowly missed a majority when he was reelected in 1996 with 49%. Perot was on the ballot again. Al Gore carried the popular vote in 2000, but it was not quite a majority, 48%. John Kerry in 2004, same thing, 48% no victory. The breakthrough finally came in 2008 when Barack Obama won a solid majority, 53%, the highest percentage for a Democratic president since Lyndon Johnson. Even so, you could argue that the 2008 Democratic vote was inflated by the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. What if there'd been no crisis? That's why Obama's re-election in 2012 came as such a shock. Obama was re-elected with a majority, 51%, despite a sluggish economic recovery. The new America came out to protect its president and to prove that its coming to power was not a fluke. However, 2016 was an even bigger shock because Trump's primary and general election victories were unexpected. Standoff, How America Became Ungovernable by Bill Schneider.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Well, happy Tuesday. What a beautiful... It's going to rain today and fall is here, right? The leaves are starting to fall. I'm guessing it is all over the country, or at least all over the northern half. Amazing. And as the leaves are falling, so are the laws. We'll get to all that in just a minute. How do we take America back from the suckers and the uber wealthy? Who are these suckers? How did they end up there? I want to talk about that. I want to get into what the NBA is doing and how... You know, they're sort of trying to stand up for principle, but they're also not standing up for principle. And you got all these American corporations that are just totally sucking up to the Chinese dictators. In our second hour, we're going to get into the new pink McCarthy scare. This is apropos of what's going before the Supreme Court today. We'll get into that in an hour. And in our third hour, Alex Lawson is going to drop by, the director of Social Security Works, or I believe he's one of the founders, actually. About how, this latest campaign by the Republicans to privatize Medicare and destroy it in advance of the possibility of it becoming Medicare for all, and how Nafta 2.0 is going to damage that as well. A couple of quick news things that I think are really, really, really worth knowing about. Number one, you'll recall yesterday that there were a few people who were talking about how the reason why Trump sold out the Kurds was because he was weak, that he gave in to Erdogan. And, that sounds like a slogan, right? It sounds like some kind of political complaint. It doesn't sound like something that's real or if it is, it's like, well, how is that, right? And so, it kind of got brushed off and people ignored it, and it really didn't become even much of a media story. But NBC News is now reporting, in fact, Willie Geist laid this out this morning on Joe Scarborough's program, that when Trump went to New York to the United Nations meeting, he did not have a one-on-one sit-down with Erdogan, the president of, now dictator, he's declared military rule, of Turkey. And Erdogan took this as an insult and has been fuming and was furious. So he called up Trump. This was, a couple days ago, Friday night, I guess. Called up, or Sunday night rather. I called up Trump and just, let go with both cannons. You're disrespecting me, and Turkey's an important ally, and we buy things from you, and we buy jets from you, and maybe we should buy them from Europe, and maybe we should buy them from Russia, and what the hell do you think you're doing? And Trump was like, oh, I'm so sorry, Mr. Erdogan, I'm so sorry. Would you like to come to the White House? You can sleep in the Lincoln bedroom. We'll do a state dinner for you. We'll roll out the red carpet. And Erdogan was like, that's not enough. That's not enough. You owe me big, And of course, I'm not constructing this faux conversation here from any kind of narrative or transcript that the White House has provided, simply from the reporting that we're getting around this. This still did not appease him. And so finally, Erdogan says, you want me to stop being angry with you? Let me go into northern Syria and clean out those terrorists, meaning the Kurds. At which point Trump said, okay, cool, no problem, I'll do that. And suddenly Erdogan was, well, Donald, it's so nice, and thank you so much. And by the way, thank you for inviting me to the White House. I'd be glad to come. This morning, the White House announced that Erdogan is coming next month for a state dinner. So Trump really and truly did wimp out. And that speaks to this larger issue, which is, if you don't have any principles, you've got nothing. It's true of individuals, and it's true of businesses. It's true of nations. If you don't have principles, you've got nothing. And Trump has no principles. His only principle is, I win, they lose. Right? That's it. Everything is in the context of that. I mean, probably not probably. The reason why most of us obey the law is it's not because we're afraid of going to jail. I don't walk into the bank and hand them a note saying, give me $1,000 because I'm afraid of going to jail. I don't do it because it would be wrong. I understand it would be disruptive of banking and of society. I mean, most of us don't walk, you and I presumably don't walk through stores looking over our shoulders trying to figure out where the cops are to decide whether or not to shoplift something. We just don't shoplift because we know it's wrong. I mean, it's just, and this is stuff we learn when we're little kids. The difference between wrong and right, or right and wrong. We don't speed because we know, we all speed a little bit, but we don't speed crazy because we all know that it's dangerous, and that's why there's rules. It's not because we're afraid the cops are going to catch us. That happens very rarely. And what Trump is saying, essentially, like this morning, where he says that Gordon Sondland, the U.S. ambassador to the European Union, who is involved in these acting as Trump's guy in these communications, with the other people involved in the whole Ukraine thing, about leaning on the new president of Ukraine, to quote, get some dirt on Joe Biden in exchange for we'll give you those weapons and that money that you wanted. Trump says no, he can't testify. Why? Well, because it doesn't matter what the rules are. It just matters if I get to win in his world. And by the way, we call this sociopathy, by the way, apathy, a sickness, a pathology, and socio-society. A sociopath doesn't care about, the wealth and health of society. A sociopath cares only about themselves. And this sociopathy that Trump has inflicted upon us as a country I mean, he's been running a sociopathic business or a series of sociopathic businesses his entire life. He inherited a sociopathic business from his daddy. And now he's running our country in a sociopathic fashion. He's surrounding himself with sociopaths, people like Bill Barr, for whom, again, the rule of law doesn't matter. It's what you can get away with, not what's right or what's wrong. And we know that from what Bill Barr did back in 1992 doing the cover-up of Iran-Contra. But here's where it gets really, really dangerous and destructive. Trump, by doing this, is setting an example for our nation. And the maggot hats, people and young people who are being exposed to this are starting to think, oh yeah, I guess the rules don't really matter. What matters is if you win. What matters is if you get your way. And now we're seeing that kind of thinking. We're seeing that at the NBA. We're seeing this in Congress. We're seeing this at the level of countries. You've got Viktor Orban in Hungary rewriting the Constitution to basically make himself above the law. You've got President Duda in Poland, same deal. I don't know if he's rewritten the Constitution yet, but he's certainly passed a bunch of laws that give him more power. In the Philippines, Duterte, has encouraged his police to execute over 10,000 people without trial, without even an arrest. Just walk up and shoot them in the head if you find them using drugs or think that they're using drugs. And Trump, when he called him up, says, hey, great job with your war on drugs there. Yes, what's right doesn't matter. We're seeing this now in Brazil with Jair Bolsonaro. And, oh, yeah, let's burn the Amazon. Oh, no, I didn't burn the Amazon. Hey, somebody's burning the Amazon. Well, maybe it's not burning. Maybe it is. We're seeing this in Russia. We're seeing this in the stand countries. We're seeing it in Indonesia. You see it in India with Modi. We've been seeing it for some time now in Pakistan. For, a decade and a half at least, 2 decades. We're seeing it now in Iraq and Afghanistan. No, we're not operating on principles, they're saying. Principles don't matter. What matters is, how much money we've got, if we're winning or not. Warren Buffett, back, a decade or so ago, famously said that he pays a lower income tax rate than his secretary. And PolitiFact checked that out. As David Leonhardt points out in yesterday's New York Times, PolitiFact checked that out, or day before yesterday's, and said, no, this is not the norm. Maybe true of Warren Buffett, but it's not the norm. Rich people actually pay more taxes than middle-class people. Well, guess what? Now, as David Leonhardt reports, for the first time on record, the 400 wealthiest Americans last year paid a lower tax rate, spanning federal, state, and local taxes than any other income group. The uber rich paid a lower tax rate than the working poor. The overall tax rate on the richest 400 households last year was only 23%. Now, in 1950, it was 70%. In 1947, in 1980, it was 47%. That's what they actually paid. Now it's 23%. And we wonder why, the rich are just, this explosion of super riches. We got an explosion of super riches because the people who are the recipients of this, by and large, don't care about what's good for society. This is sociopathy. This is sociopathic behavior. They just hire lobbyists to buy politicians to get them the lowest possible tax rate. And the result of that is the absolute destruction of the middle class. Fewer than 50% of Americans are now in the American middle class. 60% of Americans can't afford a $400 expense. They'd be wiped out. 20% of American children don't have adequate nutrition. 10% of American children are living so far below the poverty line, they experience hunger at least one day a year. You've got kids who are showing up for school literally hungry. I mean, and it turns out that there's actually a process that got us here. That Christopher Wiley, the guy who worked for Cambridge Analytica, has laid out in a new book. And, I'm going to riff about that a little bit when we come back from the break. But this is how we got here, and it's a pretty damn scary story. And then I also want to get into what's going on with the NBA, because I think this is all basically one story. Money rules.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
When money rules, principles go out the window. And there you have your sociopathic behavior. And welcome back. Morris in Long Beach, California, listening on KPFK. Hey, Morris, what's up?
Hey, Professor, perfect strategy for the Democrats. Don't do nothing. Stay out of the way. No, don't say anything. Let this fool continue to defy Congress. These subpoenas that they're sending out. Mm-hmm. You see, Professor, down here on the ground, when you get a subpoena, you go to court. Now, if you don't respect the subpoena, the next step is you're looking for a warrant for your arrest.
Right.
Whatever happened to the rule of law, I heard you talking about. So they don't need to do anything. Let this fool continue to defy these subpoenas, because the American public, who don't read nothing, who are not very intelligent, they're not that stupid. They know about defying subpoenas. And if you notice these numbers, they're going up, up, up for impeachment, the inquiry, the whole thing. And why is it going up? Not because of our messaging, because of what they're doing. They're defying the rule of law in front of all of us. And the American public, they're going to make them pay. Now, if Congress ain't got the power to get to do nothing, I promise you the people do. But Congress has got to do something. Forget what the price might be, because you got that that responsibility to do something when things like this are taking place. But the Democrats, my brother, they got dirt on their hands too. So don't do nothing. Just let these fools continue to defy subpoenas openly. Yeah. And they'll just cut their own throats.
Yeah, subpoena is Latin for under penalty. Sub is under, pena is part of, penalty, the word of penalty. And that's what we're talking about here. These subpoenas are under threat of penalty. You will, perform whatever the subpoena tells you to do. You'll turn over papers, or you'll come and testify, or whatever. And yeah, Sonderland this morning was not subpoenaed. He was invited to speak. He had volunteered to speak. Now he's been ordered by Bill Barr, by the Justice Department, not to speak. And so now they're going to issue a subpoena, and we'll see where that goes. We'll see what happens. Liberty in Seattle. Whoop, hang on just a second here. There you go. Liberty in Seattle. What's up?
Hi there. I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about the thing happening in Syria with the Kurds.
Yeah.
And how it's actually related to the impeachment scandal. So I don't know if you follow this person on Facebook, Heather Cox Richardson. She's a historian.
I don't.
At Boston College.
I don't do pretty much anything on Facebook.
Okay. Well, she's got this theory that basically it's all connected back to how Trump was elected by Russia, and the whole hope of why Russia basically threw itself behind Trump's campaign was that they want these sanctions to be lifted, specifically on Rosneft, which is their oil company, right? So in the Kurdish area, there's all this oil, right? And Rosneft has been trying to get access to it for years.
Where is all this oil?
In Kurdistan. In the area.
Yeah, the Kurds are sitting on some of the most oil-rich parts of Iraq, for example.
Right, exactly. And how it's connected back to Ukraine is this is also a very oil-rich area, right? So that's all Russia has is oil, although they're running out in their areas, so they're going to other places to get it. So basically, what's happened is Rosneft announced that it was going to convert all of its holdings to euros because the sanctions in the U.S. are still there.
They announced this just a couple days ago.
That's right. And so this is actually so her theory is that this is actually an act of Trump to try to do what he can at the last minute, because he's probably not going to have much control to lift any sanctions, right? So, and also he's been offered sort of a percentage of Rosneft. Anyway, interesting theory. I just would love to know what you think about that.
It wouldn't surprise me at all. I suspect rather than being given a piece of Rosneft, he's been promised that he'll have his Trump Tower in Moscow, and and maybe even the Russians will help him build it. I mean, who knows? But we really, after the Saudis bought the 45th floor of Trump Tower, I mean, we've seen Trump just basically admit he's owned by them. Liberty, thank you for the call. want to welcome back. Day after tomorrow, Thursday night, 7:30 p.m., Powell's City of Books on Burnside here in Portland. If you're in the Portland area, I will be giving a rant about the hidden history of the Supreme Court and the betrayal of America. And in fact, I'm going to get into that conversation a little bit today as well in our second hour. But anyhow, so if you're in the neighborhood, check it out. The other thing I wanted to share with you is the story of Christopher Wiley. He's doing the media circuit. We're trying to get him on our show right now. He was on Rachel Maddow last night. He was on Joe Scarborough's show this morning. He's the guy who is working at Cambridge Analytica. Well, actually, first he was working for a Department of Defense contractor. And at the Department of Defense, at this contractor, they were looking into how do we prevent more Americans from being radicalized by ISIS. Right? They were seeing actually, young Americans watching ISIS videos and getting on planes and going off to Turkey or wherever the transshipment point was and trying to get into Syria, trying to get into Iraq, trying to get into, wherever it may be so they could volunteer to be members of ISIS. And so the question that Christopher Wiley was charged with answering was, what is the personality profile of a person vulnerable to this kind of indoctrination? So that we can basically prevent them from being indoctrinated, so we can immunize them, so we can help them, so we can reach out to them. Excuse me. And they worked up a particular psychological profile of people who were vulnerable to being indoctrinated basically by a cult. And these people typically had money problems. They had struggled with religion and relationships in their lives. They felt marginalized. They were inclined to have particular preferences with regards to things like cars and where they live and how they live. And I mean, there's just this whole psychological profile that was also a behavioral profile, which you could figure out quite easily by simply looking at all the data that Facebook had on them. Facebook knows where they live. Facebook knows how big their house is. Facebook knows what they paid for their house. Facebook knows how many times they go on social media. Facebook knows what they complain about. Facebook knows what they're upset about. Facebook knows what their gender preferences are, what issues freak them out, all this kind of stuff. And so with this data from Facebook, it was possible to identify people who might be radicalized by ISIS. So then Christopher Wiley gets hired by Cambridge Analytica. Steve Bannon comes in and basically takes over the company. The billionaire Mercer family is funding this thing. And they say to Christopher Wiley, now we're going to take this tool, this knowledge that you've figured out, and we're going to target Americans. These very Americans, these vulnerable Americans, we're going to target vulnerable Americans with a message that will turn them into the alt-right so that they will support Donald Trump, so that he can become elected president and he will cut the taxes on billionaires like the Mercer family. And he will restore the greatness of a white society to America like Steve Bannon and the alt-right want. And that's exactly what they did. And that's largely how Trump got close enough that he could win through the Electoral College. And as Elizabeth Warren is pointing out right now, they're preparing to do it again. And she's speaking out very loudly about that. But this is exactly what happened. So my question to you is, how do you deprogram a person who's bought into this cult that was done with a multi-million-dollar marketing campaign, first screening for and then targeting vulnerable people, and then essentially breaking them psychologically? How do we help them realize that by aligning themselves with billionaires and polluting corporations, they're hurting themselves?
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And how do we get back our middle class now that, several Republican administrations of giant tax cuts have wiped it out? Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Vince Houghton's Nuking the Moon and Other Intelligence Schemes and Military Plots Left on the Drawing Board. This is Chapter 7, Operation Northwoods. On April 17, 1961, more than 1,400 Cuban exiles forming the Brigada de Asalto 2506 landed on the beaches of Cuba at Playa Girón in the Bahia de Cojinos, the Bay of Pigs. Their mission was to overthrow the regime of Fidel Castro, Cuba's increasingly communist leader, who had himself overthrown the regime of American ally Batista just 2 years before. A communist leader just 90 miles from Key West was a rather painful thorn in the side of the newly inaugurated President John F. Kennedy, and his ouster was considered a high national security priority, as it had been for Kennedy's predecessor, Dwight Eisenhower. The invasion was backed by the U.S. government and the CIA. We can argue why the Bay of Pigs invasion failed until we're blue in the face, and many people still do. For many in the Cuban exile community, the mission failed because JFK refused to give American naval and air support, elements called in for the original plan developed by the Eisenhower administration. Maybe this is true. The problem here is that we begin to descend into the realm of the counterfactuals, the if-onlys and what-ifs, things that we are doing our damnedest to avoid. Look, I've met a lot of the Cubans who took part in that invasion, many of whom are permanently settled in or around Miami, my hometown. They are impressive men, and I wouldn't put anything past them. If they say they could have kicked out Castro with U.S. naval and air support, who am I to argue? But I still will, because things are much more complicated from an intelligence perspective. Despite the lack of air and naval support, and despite the intensity and desire of the Cuban exile forces, it would have been immeasurably difficult to overcome one of the most problematic aspects of the entire invasion. Castro not only knew they were coming, he knew when and where they were coming. A combination of piss-poor information security, or in today's parlance, InfoSec, with the ability of Cuban intelligence to infiltrate the Miami exile community meant that the secret mission to free Cuba of Castro was anything but secret. It's not like this was a huge surprise for the CIA or the U.S. military. The Cuban intelligence service was very good, and some in the exile community had loose lips. In this environment, it was nearly impossible to conduct effective counterintelligence and keep the invasion secret. Most telling of all, the Soviets had literally broadcast their knowledge of the mission 4 days before it happened. On April 13th, Radio Moscow released an English-language newscast in which they predicted an invasion of Cuba by CIA-trained exiles within the week. It seems they were trying to warn us against carrying out the invasion, a type of deterrence through propaganda. Hey, we know you're coming, so perhaps now is not a good time for your secret operation. Clearly, that didn't work. The blowback from the failed mission was significant on multiple levels. More than 100 members of the 2506 Brigade were killed in combat, along with 4 American volunteer pilots from the Alabama Air National Guard, who were contracted by the CIA. Hundreds more in Cuba would be executed in the days and weeks following the invasion, as Castro eliminated anyone suspected of abetting the exiles. More than 1,200 of the brigade would be captured by the Cuban government, and some of those members were subsequently executed. The Kennedy administration was embarrassed by the failed mission. The U.S. government looked inept in failing to maintain order even in its own backyard. In the zero-sum game of the Cold War, where victory for one of the superpowers was defeat for the other, this was a huge win for the Soviets. Not to mention that the invasion pushed Castro even more firmly into the Soviet sphere of influence. And as far as the strength of the regime was concerned, the Bay of Pigs invasion did the exact opposite of what was intended. It made Castro's regime more powerful than ever before. The operation was a great political victory for the Cubans at home and abroad. Castro was a hero in the eyes of his people for defeating the Yankee invasion and was able to consolidate his power. The fiasco also elevated the Cuban government to a newfound global status, transforming communist Cuba from a grieved little country to an equal in the eyes of the world. In fact, Argentinian physician turned Cuban revolutionary Ernesto Che Guevara actually thanked the United States for the failed invasion. The CIA bore the brunt of the blame for the failed mission. President Kennedy fired CIA Director Allen Dulles, along with Deputy Director Charles Cabell and Deputy Director for Plans Richard M. Bissell, the 3 men who made up the core of the agency's leadership, particularly in the realm of covert action. Kennedy also removed, at least temporarily, major paramilitary operations from the purview of the CIA. For more than a decade, CIA had been the agency with primary responsibility for paramilitary covert operations, but now it was benched. Into the void leapt the U.S. military. In June 1961, about 2 months after the Bay of Pigs, President Kennedy approved National Security Action Memoranda 55, 56, and 57, which codified the shift in paramilitary responsibility from the CIA to the Pentagon. Nothing else really changed. The U.S. government was still looking for ways to oust Castro from power, just through a different government agency. By autumn, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations, Brigadier General Edward Lansdale, a legendary intelligence officer, or infamous, or both, depending on your perspective, was asked to brainstorm ideas to get rid of Fidel. He didn't disappoint. In February 1962, Lansdale provided a document titled Possible Actions to Provoke, Harass, or Disrupt Cuba. Some of the actions are pretty good, some are quite silly, and some are downright abhorrent. The book is Nuking the Moon by Vince Houghton.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. You'll recall where I started with this rant, and the continuous thread through the whole thing, whether it's the fact that the 400 richest families in America who now control more wealth than the bottom 80% or 90% of Americans, that they are now paying a lower income tax rate than you or I do, than basically any working people, anybody making between 20 and whatever $1,000 a year. That it's, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything, all right? That's the old cliche. If you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. If you don't stand for principles, then you've got nothing. And the principle that American business has been standing for since the 1980s, since the Reagan Revolution, since we reconfigured our political system and our economic system in the mold of Chicago School economics, of Milton Friedman and those whack jobs over there, the libertarians, the objectivists and whatnot. The principle that they've been holding to is profit, that money is the only thing that counts. And now we're seeing this very delicate dance playing out with American companies doing business in China, and in fact, depending on China for their survival. I mean, you've got major toy companies in the United States that if they had to stop buying from China tomorrow, they'd be out of business. It'd take them a year or two to build factories here in the United States, or find other sources or build factories in other countries. They'd probably start, in Vietnam or something first if Congress wasn't to pass some sort of comprehensive protectionist legislation, like tariffs and things, which Congress frankly should. But the bottom line is that the NBA, I mean, this is so amazing. This guy, and forgive me if I get any of these details wrong. I don't follow sports. I love watching baseball, and I like watching football actually. But basketball never even, I played it a little bit when I was in high school, but never really interested me. So I don't know who any of these teams are, any of these owners are, but in any case, apparently the general manager of the Houston Rockets, Mr. Morey, said something about, to the Hong Kong protesters to basically go democracy, which is supposed to be an American value, right? It used to be we didn't suck up to dictators, well, we always have actually. I mean, the Saudis, we made them basically, but we didn't do it publicly. Publicly, we said, oh no, the Soviet Union, we don't like those values. We don't like dictator value. We like democratic countries, democratic republics. We like the European countries. We like Canada. We want Mexico to be less corrupt and more democratic, small d. We used to say that. And now we don't. Now Trump is saying, hey, it doesn't matter. Crimes don't matter. Congress doesn't matter. The rule of law doesn't matter. What matters is if I win. I mean, he's got, in Scotland, they're suing him for paying legal fees because he sued to try to stop a wind farm off the coast of Scotland that would have been in the line of sight of his property at Tunbury. He lost, and part of losing was he had to pay the legal fees of the government because he instituted the lawsuit. And the Trump organization is now saying, oh, sorry, we're not going to pay. Right? He doesn't care about the law. And now you've got, the NBA stuck in the middle of this thing with Hong Kong. And you've got a bunch of other American companies that are just keeping their heads down. I mean, the NBA is looking at literally $1.5 billion streaming deal with Tencent, which is a streaming company in China. And China just said, okay, that's it. We're not going to, this is for CCTV, for China's Central Television Network. In fact, I've been on CCTV. One of my first producers, just a wonderful woman, who went to work for CCTV in Washington, D.C. They have said now, no, we're not going to play the pregame shows, the NBA pregame shows. In other words, the NBA is threatened with losing money. But now Adam Silver has come out and said, well, we support Maury's right to free speech, but we also, kind of like China, we don't mean to insult you guys. Now, you've got airlines like United Airlines that have literally changed their route maps and their airline designations to indicate that Taiwan is not a separate country and that Macau is not a separate country, that they're part of China. You've got American companies like United Airlines sucking up to the Chinese. You've got American companies like Apple and Microsoft sucking up to the Chinese. Hundreds of them. And the NBA now is kind of caught in the middle. What do we do? Do we stand for American values? Well, I guess the question is, do American values even matter anymore? I mean, as the Chinese crackdown is going on, Trump hasn't said a word. Used to be, think back to Tiananmen Square. Tiananmen Square was in the very late 80s, was it not, as I recall? 89, thank you, Nate. In 1989, that would have been George Herbert Walker Bush's presidency. So you had a Republican in office, and still we were speaking out about China massacring people in the streets. But, oh, no, not now. Not a word out of Donald Trump. And these are protesters who are walking around carrying, statues of and American flags. And here's what, and this is where it gets really grim. The Chinese came out and said, this is from Chinese state media, we are strongly unsatisfied and opposed to Adam Silver's claim of supporting Mr. Maury's right of having freedom of speech. Any remarks that challenge national sovereignty and social stability are outside the category of freedom of speech. Now, how long before that kind of thinking becomes how we think here in the United States? Trump just, tweeted last week, congratulations to President Xi and the Chinese people on the 70th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. Was there a word in support of the Hong Kong protesters, or just in support of the idea of, pluralistic democracy? No, because the only value, the one singular value that Donald Trump has and that the Trump administration has and that American business has is money, is making money. So we're seeing the Kurds being abandoned because Trump was afraid to stand up to Erdogan, and because he owns 2 Trump towers in Istanbul, Turkey. And I'll bet you anything, when we finally get the transcript, that Erdogan was saying, hey, nice little hotel you got there, be a shame if something happened to it. So Trump is like, yeah, screw the Kurds. This is where we're at. And this is where, and these poor Trumpettes, these poor people who follow Donald Trump, who listen to right-wing hate radio and live in the Fox News ecosphere, the little bubble around Trump TV. These poor people, what are our values? Are we in favor of the middle class? Trump talks about bringing back our jobs. Oh, Trump doesn't want to. What are our values? Rich people getting tax cuts? I guess that's a good thing, isn't it? Maybe. Well, at least he's making it hard for more brown and black people to get into America. Isn't that a good thing? Yeah. That's in so many cases, that's where we're left. That's what it all boils down to. John in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hey, John, what's on your mind today?
How you doing today?
Good. What's up?
All right. I feel that the poor whites feel more it's a problem because they felt entitled, because wages are leveling out all over the world. In other words, the Chinese want to get paid higher. So when Trump came out and said, "Make America Great Again," I, as a black man, knew exactly what he was saying. And everybody knew exactly what he was saying. So basically, he's taking people off of an intellectual level and putting them on an emotional level.
Yep.
So that's how he's getting...
That's what cult leaders do, John.
Yeah. And so he has people voting against their own interests. You know, a poor white person and a poor black person is in the same boat.
Yep.
So...
Yep.
And like middle class is not hardly any middle class anymore. So basically, it's a con game, because I've been in business and I've dealt with, you know, rich whites, and they are less racial, because not that they like you, but they don't like anybody. I'm not saying all of them.
I get it. I get it.
And so that's my reply.
I think your observation is spot on, John. Thank you for calling and sharing it with us. Rose, listening to WBAI in Flemington or Elizabeth, New Jersey. Which is it, Rose?
It's Flemington.
Flemington. What's up?
Boy, John had it right on the button, didn't he?
I think so. Yeah, I think he nailed it.
Yeah, he's got the same crystal ball that you do. What I'm concerned about is that this country seems to have had an overload of Ritalin in its Kool-Aid, or maybe something a little stronger.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, we don't read anymore. You know, I mean, it's gotten so demented. It's pitiful. That's why people like that can get where they get, because nobody reads. Nobody says, "Well, wait a minute. I think I saw a map 40 years ago."
Right.
Now, to the Kurds' point of view, I don't remember if you recall. By the way, I've been blind for 15 years, but before that time, I used to go to great museums like the Met and saw, all the art from Afghanistan and from Iraq. And I've been paying attention very hard to this. And I know, if you remember the picture of on the New York Times, was a woman on the back of a pickup truck. She was a Kurd lady with an AK-47 or Kalashnikov. They're going to have a hard time with those girls. Those girls are going to put up a fight. I mean, that's the old Silk Road. Mm-hmm. And the Kurdish people are very, very bright. They're not stupid.
That's right.
They will trick these Looney Tunes into the caves that are subcontractor.
Oh, the Kurds have been fighting this fight for 1,000 years.
Yeah, exactly.
Just like the Iranians have, just like the Persians have. I mean, you've got these groups that are not just. They don't just think of themselves as racial groups or religious groups or ethnic groups or political groups. They think of themselves as all those things and family, and you die for your family.
Yeah. And the crazy thing is, it's like the Vietnam War. We were not prepared for jungle warfare either at the end of World War II or in Vietnam. Yep. And when you've lived in those kind of societies where somebody's going to stomp through and, take what you got for so many centuries, every nook and cranny, every point to peek down and shoot. And this is not going to be an easy piece of cake. It's all part of the project for the new American century.
Yep.
They had decided they were going to go to first take out Libya, then Syria.
No, first Iraq.
Benghazi ship.
First Iraq, but yeah. Rose, I'm sorry we're running out of time, but you're spot on, and I look forward to future conversations with you. Very, very great observations. Thank you so much for the call. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Back with more of your calls in just a moment. It's 47 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program, helping you win the water cooler wars, the place where despair is not an option. And welcome back. Terry in Lowell, Massachusetts. Hey, Terry, what's on your mind today? Terry? I'm not hearing Terry. You got him up on okay, let's try Steve, listening on KPFK in Yorba Linda, California. Hey, Steve. Can you hear me?
Hello. Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me okay?
Just fine, sir. Excuse
me.
Yeah.
You know, you have a lot of insight on a lot of things. At one point, my question and comment is, what percentage of the Chinese economy is actually U.S. corporations that have offloaded jobs over there?
Initially, it was really, really high. I would say back in the through the 90s, it was really substantial. I mean, like 70-80%. But now you find European companies are manufacturing in China. South American companies are manufacturing in China. It's like you find Chinese goods all over the world, privately labeled or labeled under the brands of other companies. So I'm guessing, probably it's and also China has developed a huge internal market. There are more middle class people in China than there are in the United States now. So I'm guessing that it's probably down in the 20s or 30s. But this is just all wild ass guesses on my part, Steve.
Yeah, I think I looked it up online once. It came back 40% or something like that.
Yeah.
But that's the bottom line. You can talk about China and the Chinese government, but really what we're talking about to a large economic activity is U.S. corporations.
Yeah.
And where they've chosen to put their resources.
And not just U.S. corporations generally. It's not just like, Toys R Us and Ivanka Trump clothing brand stuff being made in China and, sold in Walmart or Kmart or whatever it may be. We can't make a cruise missile right now without parts from China. We can't make a nuclear strike force battle carrier group without parts from China. And there have been a few kind of people who have been viewed as crackpots who have been pointing this out for over a decade now. They tend to get marginalized, and more often than not, they're Democrats like Sherrod Brown has been pointing this stuff out, or people outside the party like Mike Gravel who's been pointing this stuff out. But this isn't just an economic security issue. This is a national security issue. And we do need, when Trump campaigned on how, we've all been screwed by first the Nafta deal and then the WTO, the stuff that was put together during the Reagan administration and then implemented during the Clinton administration, and that both Republicans and neoliberal Democrats have been in bed with each other on, ever since the 1980s. Trump was absolutely right about that. The problem is that the solution is not to do this by executive order under state of emergency, which is how Trump is doing it, because that can get wiped out as soon as the president leaves office. And nobody's going to build a factory based on what one single president says. The solution is for Congress to pass laws to bring back the tariffs that we had prior to the Reagan administration. Go back to a protectionist trade policy that encourages manufacturers to manufacture here. And it's going to take a decade for factories to be rebuilt in the United States. At least. And so if we cut off the Chinese or they cut us off suddenly, the shock will go both ways. And that's why it's like, mutual assured destruction here, Steve.
Our economy is still a heck of a lot larger than China. And most people don't recognize that. They should look it up.
China's economy is now $15 trillion, and ours is between 17 and 19, depending on how you calculate it. But last year it was $15 trillion for China, and they're growing at 6%. I mean, that's huge, Steve. Did you want to reply? No? Yes?
Find anything from Home Depot that's not made in China.
Yeah, exactly, or Walmart or anything else. Steve, thanks for the call. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, 51 minutes past the hour. And Patrick on Long Island in New York. Hey, Patrick, what's up?
Hi, Tom. I know you're up against the hour stop. I was just thinking two things. I had an experience over the weekend where I spoke with a Trump voter and had mentioned that Trump had basically extorted the Ukraine,
right.
And that was not really the way to talk to people. And she said, well, I know a whole lot of people, and it's more or less a wealthy circle, that would think that kind of talk was perfectly okay.
Right.
And the second part I wanted to make
the ends justify the means, in other words.
Correct. If it's a little bit of a tax break for them and more money in their pockets, so what?
Exactly.
Let him talk what he wants.
Yeah,
but
David,
on the other hand,
did you see, Patrick, did you see the piece that David Brooks wrote in the New York Times about this yesterday or the day before?
No, I hadn't.
It's really worth reading. Anyhow, continue your rant.
And on the other hand, Trump, as all of the showmen, he's friends with Vince McMahon from wrestling. He knows the art, as I said, the art of finding people's vulnerable spot, which is usually their anger.
Right.
That's the first one that they can come up without them thinking too much about it.
Yep, that's one of the things that Cambridge Analytica was filtering out of Facebook for.
Yeah, finding people who, I hate to say it, but disenfranchised from life and are angry.
That's right. That's right. And then those were the people that they indoctrinated and said, okay, you're going to become the alt-right, guys. Get ready. And they did. And, you know, and now, you know, as Elizabeth Warren is tweeting right now, and she's talking about this, and God bless her for having the courage to take on Facebook, is that Facebook is fixing to rig our elections again, the exact same way with many of the same players. Patrick, thanks for the call. John in New York City listening on WBAI. Hey, John, what's up?
Hi, Tom. A couple things, please. First of all, with respect to Trump pulling out of Syria, it's my understanding that he's pulling 26 men out of Syria, which is, you know, to people who make a big stink about that. I'm old enough to tell you that I demonstrated against the Vietnam War. I'm anti-war. So when I hear, and I used to be what's called a liberal, but when I am actually, you'd call me an alt-right, but I'm anti-war. So when Trump says he's pulling out of Syria, yes, the Kurds are great, but all these people that object, that complain about this, I don't see them going to war. I've called up representatives who...
But here's the point, John. We are not fighting a war in Syria. Our guys in Syria are not engaged in combat, never have been. They're there to support the Kurds. The Kurds have lost between 10 and 15,000 people taking down ISIS in Syria. They've seized a massive territory. It's probably the size of Texas, you know, or maybe half that. You know, the northeastern Syria, and you know, which is also an area that may well have a lot of oil, and where the Kurds have historically lived. We've just been there providing basically support to them. We back out, and Turkey comes in and eats their lunch.
So first of all, Trump actually said that if they do something like that, he will go after Turkey.
He said that after he realized that when he caved into Erdogan, he had screwed the Kurds. He had so little understanding of that situation that when Erdogan called him up, all pissed off because he didn't get his private meeting at the UN, and Trump tried to placate him by offering him a visit to the White House, and that wasn't enough. And Erdogan then said, well, I want you to give me free rein, you know, to go into Syria and clear out those terrorists. And Trump didn't even know what he was talking about. He just said, okay, cool, we'll back out of the way and we'll let you do it. You know, you're our ally, sure, you're part of NATO, go in there, take them. And then the next day, you know, his own military advisors are like, oh my God, you know, or you're putting guys who fought on our behalf against ISIS, and our behalf being Western values, if nothing else. You're putting these guys at the, you know, in the crosshairs of the new dictator of Turkey.
Well, I agree with you that the Erdogan is a dictator.
Shouldn't we stop genocide when we can, John? I mean, if the Turks go into northern Syria, the Kurds live there. It's not just their fighters; they live there. Their families are there. I mean, they could kill hundreds and probably will slaughter hundreds of thousands of Kurds.
No, I agree with you, but you know, your previous caller mentioned the agenda of the New American Century,
right,
and which you acknowledged to be true, that we under false pretext we go in and we invade, really for oil, all these Middle Eastern countries, and Syria was one of them. And I believe that you were against that.
Oh, I am, and I agree. Syria was on the list, on PNAC's list. But that's not what we're doing there. What we've been doing there is supporting the Kurds against ISIS. It's been a very limited thing. There's only a couple thousand U.S. troops there. And so, you know, we've got to, John, I got to run here. Thanks a lot for the call. But I think that, as I said yesterday, I think what we should be doing is we should be getting together with Europe and the rest of NATO, not just Turkey, and saying, let's work something out so that we can have peace in this region. We'll be back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Our book today is Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism and Other Arguments for Economic Independence by Kristen Godsey. And this is from the introduction titled, You Might Be Suffering from Capitalism. The argument of this book can be summed up succinctly. Unregulated capitalism is bad for women. And if we adopt some ideas from socialism, women will have better lives. If done properly, socialism leads to economic independence, better labor conditions, better work-family balance, and yes, even better sex. Finding a way into a better future requires learning from the mistakes of the past, including a thoughtful assessment of the history of 20th century state socialism in Eastern Europe. That's it. If you like the idea of such outcomes, then come along for an exploration of how we might change things. If you're dubious because you don't understand why capitalism as an economic system is uniquely bad for women, and if you doubt that there could ever be anything good about socialism, this short treatise will provide some illumination. If you don't give a whit about women's lives because you're a gynophobic right-wing internet troll, save your money and go back to your parents' basement right now. This isn't the book for you. Of course, some might argue that unregulated capitalism sucks for almost everyone, but I want to focus on how capitalism disproportionately harms women. Competitive labor markets discriminate against those whose reproductive biology makes them primarily responsible for childbearing. Today, this means humans who get pink hats in the hospital and the letter F next to the name on their birth certificate, as if we've already failed by not coming into the world as a boy. Competitive labor markets also devalue those expected to be the primary caregivers of children. Although societal attitudes have evolved in this regard, our idealization of motherhood means that most of us still believe that baby needs mama, a whole lot more than papa, at least until the child is old enough to play sports. Others will argue that unregulated capitalism is not bad for all women. Yes, for those women lucky enough to sit at the top of the income distribution, the system works pretty well. Although women at the executive level still face gender pay gaps and remain underrepresented in leadership positions, on the whole, things aren't too shabby for the Sheryl Sandbergs of the world. Of course, sexual harassment still hinders progress, even for those at the top, and too many women believe that if you want to run with the big dogs, you may have to suck it up and ignore the groping and unwanted advances. And race plays an important role as well. White women do a lot better in aggregate than do women of color. But when we look at society as a whole, on average, women are comparatively worse off in countries where markets are less encumbered by regulation, taxation, and public enterprises than they are in nations where state revenues support greater levels of redistribution and larger social safety nets. Choose your data source, and you find the same story. Unemployment and poverty plague women with children. Employers discriminate against women without children because they might have them in the future. In the United States in 2013, women over the age of 65 suffered from poverty at much greater rates than men and dominated those in the category of extreme poverty. Globally, women face higher rates of economic deprivation. Women are often the last to be hired and the first to be fired in cyclical downturns. And when they do find employment, bosses pay them less than men. When states need to slash government spending on education, healthcare, or old age pensions, mothers, daughters, sisters, and wives must pick up the slack, diverting their energy to care for the young, the sick, and the elderly. Capitalism thrives on women's unpaid labor in the home because women's care work supports lower taxes. Lower taxes mean higher profits for those already at the top of the income ladder, mostly men. But capitalism was not always so savage. Throughout much of the 20th century, state socialism presented an existential challenge to the worst excesses of the free market. The threat posed by Marxist ideologies forced Western governments to expand social safety nets to protect workers from the unpredictable but inevitable booms and busts of the capitalist economy. After the Berlin Wall fell, many celebrated the triumph of the West, consigning socialist ideas to the dustbin of history. But for all its faults, state socialism provided an important foil for capitalism. It was in response to a global discourse of social and economic rights, a discourse that appealed not only to the progressive populations of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, but also to many men and women in Europe and Western Europe and North America, that politicians agreed to improve working conditions for wage laborers, as well as to create social programs for children, the poor, the elderly, the sick, and the disabled, mitigating exploitation and the growth of income inequality. Although there were important antecedents in the 1980s, once state socialism collapsed, capitalism shook off the constraints of market regulation and income redistribution. Without the looming threat of a rival superpower, the last 30 years of global neoliberalism have witnessed a rapid shriveling of social programs that protect citizens from cyclical instability and financial crises, and reduce the vast inequality of economic outcomes between those at the top and those at the bottom of the income distribution. For much of the 20th century, Western capitalist countries also endeavored to outdo the East European countries in terms of women's rights, fueling progressive social change. For example, the state socialists in the USSR and Eastern Europe were so successful at giving women economic opportunities outside the home that initially, for the 2 decades after the end of World War II, women's wage work was conflated with the evils of communism. The American way of life meant male breadwinners and female homemakers. But slowly, socialist championing of women's emancipation began to chip away at the Leave It to Beaver ideal. The Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957 spurred American leaders to rethink the costs of maintaining traditional gender roles. They feared the state socialists enjoyed an advantage in technological development, and why women have better sex under socialism.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Border Wars by Davis and Shear.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. We've been talking about if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything, basically. You know, the Trump and the Trump campaign and the sociopaths around Trump, the billionaire sociopaths around him, the poor suckers that they've been pulling in, Christopher Wiley laying all this stuff out. Pretty extensive stuff here in the first hour, and also talking about what's going on in Syria and the Kurds and what's going on in Hong Kong and with the NBA. I mean, it's just like, I think this is all part of one piece of fabric. By the way, I'll be talking about the hidden history of the Supreme Court, the betrayal of America here in Portland. If you're in the Portland area, Thursday night this week, day after tomorrow, at 7:30 p.m. at Powell's City of Books on Burnside, the main Powell's. So speaking of, what do you stand for? Do you stand for human rights? Do you stand for human values? Do we as a society, does America, do we value every life? Or do we only value the lives of people who are, say, straight white men? Now, if that sounds cynical, I remember in the early 1970s having to go down to the bank and sign for Louise to get a credit card because she was a woman. Women couldn't get credit cards without a man signing for them, their father, their brother, their husband. We kind of cleaned that up, but, we've passed several laws. Most of this, shows up in Title VII of the U.S. Code. But we've passed several laws saying that you can't discriminate based on sex. Well, today, the Supreme Court is hearing 3 cases, Altitude Express versus Zarda, Bostock v. Clayton County, and Harris Funeral Homes v. EEOC. 3 cases that are testing what that word sex means in Title VII. Does it mean the gender you were born? Does it mean the gender with which you identify? Does it mean the gender to which you are attracted? What does that mean? Now, the Supreme Court, and particularly when Anthony Kennedy was the swing vote on the Supreme Court in a series of 5-4 decisions, by and large, said that word sex means all those things. gender identity, all those things. But now we've got Justice, beer bong weenie waiver in there, and the disgraced, the son of Ann Gorsuch, the disgraced Reagan EPA administrator, her son Neil on there. And these guys are to the right, as far as anybody can tell, are to the right of Clarence Thomas, for goodness sake. Certainly the right of Anthony Scalia, if you thought such a thing was possible. So, what does the word sex mean in Title VII? And by the way, if you're not, if you are a straight, cisgender, if you're a straight man or woman and you're thinking, oh, this doesn't affect me, this doesn't matter, think again. If the Supreme Court strikes down these protections or declares that this part of this law is unconstitutional, it will mean that your employer can say to you, if you're a woman, you're just not feminine enough. And in fact, cases like that, in 1989, there was a case where a woman, her name was Ann Hopkins, she was working at Price Waterhouse, the accounting firm, and one of the male partners complained, and the complaint got her fired, complained that she was, quote, too macho and too pushy. She was behaving like a man. He told her, you need to take a course at charm school, little lady. And she sued. And she won. There have been cases where, other cases where employers are absolutely demanding that people conform to gender stereotypes, whether it's men not being macho enough or women not being feminine enough. For you straight people out there, this impacts you too, not to mention the fact that, we all have people who are not, just purely straight people. We all have that whole spectrum that LGBTQ represents in our lives, in our families, in our workplaces, whether you realize it or not. And of course, as more and more people have been willing to come out, more and more straight people are realizing, oh, wow. But this, while this is the question, is this the new pink McCarthyism, right? Is this going to stimulate new attacks on people? And I'm not talking just about the physical attacks that are part of life for visible minority groups in the United States, whether it's racial minority groups, religious minority groups, or in this case, gender minority groups. I'm not just talking about those kind of attacks, although they're up since Trump has been trashing basically anybody who's not a straight white man. But also legal attacks and attacks on your right to have a job in the workplace. This stuff is going before the Supreme Court today. The first case, Amy Stevens. At work, she dressed as a cisgender man. Outside of work, she was a woman. And after doing this for several years, her job, she was working for R.G. Harris Funeral Homes in Michigan as a funeral director, and would dress up as a man to be a funeral director, and then, but the rest of the time, she was who she really felt she was, a woman. 59 years old. Been on the job since 2012. Excuse me, and so she wrote a letter to her boss saying, I just have to tell you who I really am. And that I'm going to start showing up as a funeral director as a woman, not a man. And her boss said, oh, no, you aren't. Out you go. Now, last March of last year, 2018, the Sixth Circuit Court ruled that she was unlawfully fired and that word sex in Title VII includes trans people. And the funeral home appealed that to the Supreme Court, and that's going to be the first of these three cases that are being heard today. In 2010, Donald Zarda was fired from his job as a skydiver with a company called Altitude Express, thus, one of the cases being Altitude Express. He was fired for being gay. And a homophobic man, he touched this guy on the arm, as skydiving instructors are wont to do. I can tell you, having broke my back skydiving, well, I injured my back skydiving, compression fracture, skydiving on my third jump. My skydiving instructor on my first jump, I was standing out there hanging onto the strut, and with my foot on the little stand above the wheel, out there in the wind, deciding that I was going to crawl back inside the airplane, when my jump master instructor reached out of the plane with a broom and hit me in the stomach and knocked me off the wing. Boom! I was flying. But anyhow, this skydiving instructor touched this guy in the arm, and the guy was like, "Oh my God, he's gay! I'm being assaulted!" And they fired him for being gay. And he said, "No, you can't do that." And then, the appeals court, U.S. appeals court, the first court said, yeah, this doesn't, the Civil Rights Act of 64, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 64 does not cover, a gay man in this case. And then the Second Circuit Court said, no, it does. And then the third case is Gerald Bostock, a gay man who was fired from his job as a child welfare worker in Georgia, in Clayton County. And again, he's saying I was fired because of my sexual orientation. And the 11th Circuit Court said, sexual orientation doesn't matter. Off they all go to the Supreme Court. But there are larger issues here than just what I've described. I mean, this gets right to the core of what are our values as Americans, which goes back to, my half-hour-long rant from the previous hour about how Trump has no values. He doesn't understand or believe in democracy or even the rule of law. This is the sociopath, or really, sociopath, society pathology, a sickness in society, not caring about society. As I said in the last hour, you and I, in all probability, when we walk into a store, we're not looking around, where's the cops, because I really want to shoplift. We don't shoplift, not because we're afraid of the police, but because we just know it's wrong. We learned right from wrong. We don't speed because we know the speed limit laws are there so that, we all get home safely. Or if we do speed, it's just a little tiny bit. We don't walk into a bank and say to the teller, give me a wad of hundreds. Not because we're afraid of going to prison as a bank robber, but because, society wouldn't work if everybody did that. We all get this. Donald Trump doesn't. His entire life, he's gotten away with doing things that are outside the realm of right and wrong, and in many cases outside the realm of the law. And now that sociopathic thinking has spread to his followers, has spread to right-wing hate radio and Fox News, has spread to the Republican Party, and is spreading around the world. We're seeing it infect Brazil now with Bolsonaro, Orban in Hungary, Duda in Poland, Duterte in the Philippines. We're seeing it with Xi in China right now, the whole thing with the NBA. Money's the only thing that matters, right, on both sides. We're seeing it with Modi in India and what he's doing in Kashmir right now, which seems to have slipped off the front pages. We're seeing it with the Saudis bombing the bejesus out of Yemen. We're losing our values.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And I think a large part of the reason why is that we have a sociopath in the White House who has become our national example. Welcome back. Let's see here. Linda in Matlock, Washington. Hey, Linda, what's on your mind today?
Hello. Yes, what you were saying about the Trump dictatorship and his antisocial personality disorder.
Mm-hmm.
This is just right. Straight out of the DSM-5 TR. He's basically turned some of these people that have been our allies into sacrifice zones, particularly since the Kurds are going to be slaughtered, as you said, a future genocide. We're also seeing the test case for China and Xi Jinping's regime, because when the British handed over Hong Kong back to the Chinese after the lease was up, they were supposed to have 50 years of democracy. Well, we've only had about 30. And now that they are starting to go so aggressively against Hong Kong is really the test case, because the next big prize is going to be Taiwan. And they've estimated that Taiwan could only hold off the Chinese for about 8 hours.
Yep, if that.
So,
one good-sized bomb. And
Right.
I didn't know about the 50-year thing. Is that written into that lease that when the Opium Wars ended?
Yeah, I think the British gave them a lease for 99 years, and then when the transition came, I think they were supposed to guarantee some kind of democratic autonomy to that area for a certain period of time. Your researcher would have to go into that a little deeper.
Yeah,
but
my
I really
researcher
think
is me, but I'll do that.
Yeah, your staff. But
well, Sean
exactly,
and Nate look stuff up here too. But
yeah.
So
that's what they're doing. I think they're doing a test case now, because if they can pull this off, and they can silence all of the basic, the capitalists that really want to keep this market going and just keep this economy going, they are going to sacrifice democracy, and the next casualty is going to be Taiwan. And hey, Moscow Mitch's wife might have to move her family here. Immigration laws.
Yeah, or they may be very happy with it. I don't know about her family, but and also Macau. I mean, they've got Macau on their sites too.
Yeah,
amazing
so
stuff.
It's the perfect storm. You've got a sociopath in the White House, and you've got all of these old, ancient grievances that people have been just itching to settle. And he's the right guy to give it to them.
Yeah, and that's what's happening in the Middle East. It's what's happening in Europe. It's what's happening in Asia.
And if you think about how World War II ended, as far as Yalta and the agreements, and how the Middle East and how many areas of the world were carved up, we're still paying for that price, and will continue to pay.
Well, I think really that's the end of World War I. I mean, that's when the Kurds lost their territory. That's when the Middle East got redrawn, with little consideration of actual tribal communities. And frankly, I think that how World War I started, with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo, and then, basically one country decides they're upset about this, and so they take on another country, and that country has a mutual defense treaty with a third country, and that third country, and I forget the sequence that happened with World War I, but basically it was like a whole series of dominoes falling on both sides, and the piles of dominoes were just getting bigger and bigger and bigger until, boom, it was a world war, and we got dragged into it. Or Woodrow Wilson enthusiastically inserted us into it. He hired Edward Bernays to convince the Americans that we should do it. But I think World War I is the best analogy for where we're at right now. Linda, thank you for the call. Good to hear from you, and spot on. Spot on. We'll be right back. It's 22 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program. So much going on. We'll continue our conversations. Oh, and I got to tell you what the Trump campaign is up to. Again, to my point, they don't care about rules. We'll be right back. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, Everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The hidden history of the Supreme Court and the betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Thom Hartmann, you can check it out, get the whole thing. So check it out at thomhartmann.com. So one more example of Donald Trump saying, well, we don't need to play by the rules. Rules are for suckers. Minneapolis, the Target Center, it's named after Target, right? Everything is being, what used to be, owned by cities, built by cities, things like stadiums and whatnot, now they're all, they're selling branding rights. But in any case, the Target Center in Minneapolis and the city of Minneapolis is saying to Donald Trump, you want to come here and do a rally? Cool. Pay for your security in advance. Now, why would they say that? Trump is all huffing and puffing, and there's a story over in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune about this, about how Trump is huffing and puffing, and how the city calculated exactly what the expenses would be. And they based it on previous events of a similar size and things. And it's not an unreasonable amount, $530,000. What the article in the Star Tribune does not point out, but you can easily find, with a really simple, just little Google search, is, for example, this is from NBCnews.com by David Leventhal. The headline kind of says the whole thing. Why hasn't the Trump campaign paid its police security bills? The article, Donald Trump asked a cheering crowd during his rally in Lebanon, Ohio, do we love law enforcement or what? Thank you, law enforcement, Trump said. You guys are heroes. So then the Lebanon City Town Hall sends the Trump campaign an invoice for $16,191 for police overtime for the cops who were there and were protecting him. And Trump never paid it. Still isn't paid. Hasn't been paid to this day. At least 9 other city governments, from Mesa, Arizona to Erie, Pennsylvania, are still waiting for Trump to pay public safety-related invoices they've sent his presidential campaign committee in connection with his political rallies, according to interviews with local officials and municipal records obtained by the Center for Public Integrity. This is from NBC News. Some invoices are 3 years old. Trump's campaign is, just from looking at public news stories about towns that Trump is refusing to pay, it's almost $1 million. So Minneapolis says, cool, you want to come to town? El Paso, Texas. Trump owes them $470,000 for security. Hasn't paid them. So Minneapolis is saying, you want to come to town? Pay in advance. And Trump says, today, they're going to sue Minneapolis. This is getting weird. We'll be back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We've got a lot on the plate today, from what's going on in Syria to Trump's sociopathy. Pick up your calls after the break. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Vince Houghton's Nuking the Moon and Other Intelligence Schemes and Military Plots Left on the Drawing Board. This is Chapter 7, Operation Northwoods. On April 17, 1961, more than 1,400 Cuban exiles forming the Brigada de Asalto 2506 landed on the beaches of Cuba at Playa Girón in the Bahia de Cojinos, the Bay of Pigs. Their mission was to overthrow the regime of Fidel Castro, Cuba's increasingly communist leader, who had himself overthrown the regime of American ally Batista just 2 years before. A communist leader just 90 miles from Key West was a rather painful thorn in the side of the newly inaugurated President John F. Kennedy, and his ouster was considered a high national security priority, as it had been for Kennedy's predecessor, Dwight Eisenhower. The invasion was backed by the U.S. government and the CIA. We can argue why the Bay of Pigs invasion failed until we're blue in the face, and many people still do. For many in the Cuban exile community, the mission failed because JFK refused to give American naval and air support, elements called in for the original plan developed by the Eisenhower administration. Maybe this is true. The problem here is that we begin to descend into the realm of the counterfactuals, the if-onlys and what-ifs, things that we are doing our damnedest to avoid. Look, I've met a lot of the Cubans who took part in that invasion, many of whom are permanently settled in or around Miami, my hometown. They are impressive men, and I wouldn't put anything past them. If they say they could have kicked out Castro with U.S. naval and air support, who am I to argue? But I still will, because things are much more complicated from an intelligence perspective. Despite the lack of air and naval support, and despite the intensity and desire of the Cuban exile forces, it would have been immeasurably difficult to overcome one of the most problematic aspects of the entire invasion. Castro not only knew they were coming, he knew when and where they were coming. A combination of piss-poor information security, or in today's parlance, InfoSec, with the ability of Cuban intelligence to infiltrate the Miami exile community meant that the secret mission to free Cuba of Castro was anything but secret. It's not like this was a huge surprise for the CIA or the U.S. military. The Cuban intelligence service was very good, and some in the exile community had loose lips. In this environment, it was nearly impossible to conduct effective counterintelligence and keep the invasion secret. Most telling of all, the Soviets had literally broadcast their knowledge of the mission 4 days before it happened. On April 13th, Radio Moscow released an English-language newscast in which they predicted an invasion of Cuba by CIA-trained exiles within the week. It seems they were trying to warn us against carrying out the invasion, a type of deterrence through propaganda. Hey, we know you're coming, so perhaps now is not a good time for your secret operation. Clearly, that didn't work. The blowback from the failed mission was significant on multiple levels. More than 100 members of the 2506 Brigade were killed in combat, along with 4 American volunteer pilots from the Alabama Air National Guard, who were contracted by the CIA. Hundreds more in Cuba would be executed in the days and weeks following the invasion, as Castro eliminated anyone suspected of abetting the exiles. More than 1,200 of the brigade would be captured by the Cuban government, and some of those members were subsequently executed. The Kennedy administration was embarrassed by the failed mission. U.S. government looked inept in failing to maintain order even in its own backyard. In the zero-sum game of the Cold War, where victory for one of the superpowers was defeat for the other, this was a huge win for the Soviets. Not to mention that the invasion pushed Castro even more firmly into the Soviet sphere of influence. And as far as the strength of the regime was concerned, the Bay of Pigs invasion did the exact opposite of what was intended. It made Castro's regime more powerful than ever before. The operation was a great political victory for the Cubans at home and abroad. Castro was a hero in the eyes of his people for defeating the Yankee invasion and was able to consolidate his power. The fiasco also elevated the Cuban government to a newfound global status, transforming communist Cuba from a grieved little country to an equal in the eyes of the world. In fact, Argentinian physician turned Cuban revolutionary Ernesto Che Guevara actually thanked the United States for the failed invasion. The CIA bore the brunt of the blame for the failed mission. President Kennedy fired CIA Director Allen Dulles, along with Deputy Director Charles Cabell and Deputy Director for Plans Richard M. Bissell, the 3 men who made up the core of the agency's leadership, particularly in the realm of covert action. Kennedy also removed, at least temporarily, major paramilitary operations from the purview of the CIA. For more than a decade, CIA had been the agency with primary responsibility for paramilitary covert operations, but now it was benched. Into the void leapt the U.S. military. In June 1961, about 2 months after the Bay of Pigs, President Kennedy approved National Security Action Memoranda 55, 56, and 57, which codified the shift in paramilitary responsibility from the CIA to the Pentagon. Nothing else really changed. The U.S. government was still looking for ways to oust Castro from power, just through a different government agency. by autumn, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations, Brigadier General Edward Lansdale, a legendary intelligence officer, or infamous, or both, depending on your perspective, was asked to brainstorm ideas to get rid of Fidel. He didn't disappoint. In February 1962, Lansdale provided a document titled Possible Actions to Provoke, Harass, or Disrupt Cuba. Some of the actions are pretty good, some are quite silly, and some are downright abhorrent. The book is Nuking the Moon by Vince Houghton. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. The playbook for interfering in our election, whether it's Russia, China, or anybody, India, Israel, UAE, Saudi Arabia. I mean, we've had indications in the past that all of those countries at various times have considered or tried to mess with our elections. The United States Senate, and this is interesting. This is bipartisan. Senate Intelligence Committee has been looking into this thing, and they're pretty flipped out. And they're calling for Congress to do something about it. So, we'll see where this goes. It's a breaking news story right now, and we'll see how this all plays out. Gary in Baden, Pennsylvania. Hey, Gary, what's on your mind today?
Hello, Tom. Thank you once more. I know it's a little cloudy out there. It's very beautiful and sunny here in western Pennsylvania.
Oh, wonderful.
We're trying to send it your way. Believe me.
Thanks.
We keep working on it. I hope it's working.
It'll arrive around March or April.
All right, and have a great time with your book signing tonight. I hope a lot
Thursday
of
night.
people.
Yeah.
I know.
Thank you, Gary.
Will show up.
Yeah.
I wish I could be there, but I'm a long way away. But someday, you never know.
There you go. So what's up?
The reason I called, because bingo, I think you hit a core thing that obviously I believed for a long time, and I'm not trying to make judgments on anybody in America. I'm just trying to fix the problem, and that is values. And I think what transcends values is one word: humility. And I'm getting increasingly concerned that we lack enough. I'm not saying we don't have any. That we lack enough humility in our culture to solve problems, get a person like the liar in chief out of office. And I'm just hoping. I have my doubts. I'm just hoping, because the key here in the electorate to me is the upper middle class and the rich that step up above that. Unless they get involved, and right now they're on the sidelines. They don't give a lot of them. I hate to say it, I don't think they give a damn about Joe Bag of Donuts. They really don't.
Yeah.
And we need to, it's going to affect them sooner or later. It's not affecting them right now, but it will affect them. And I hope it's not too late for America.
Yeah.
So what do you think of that?
I completely agree, Gary. We learn our values and the principles of our values typically from our families, but we also learn them from the larger family, which is called society. And the father figure and hopefully someday the mother figure of our country, of our uber society, our larger society, the largest of the society, or one of the largest of the societies in which we live, is the president. And when the president says that there are no values, when the president literally lies every day, when the president revels in his lies, when the president promotes the idea that if I get away with it, that makes it okay, then that gets adopted by people who really didn't, have strong values instilled in them, or by young people who are still trying to develop their values, which I think is one of the reasons why we're seeing these young Republicans coming up and going on TV and doing these debates as if they were little mini Trumps, the whole Kellyanne Conway thing. Yeah, spot on. Gary, well said. Thank you very much for the call. Margie in Madison, Wisconsin. Hey, Margie, what's up?
I think you have it backwards.
Okay. Tell me how.
I think we have a sociopath in the White House because we don't have values. We've claimed to have values.
Well, I thought I was making that point, that in the 1980s, when in the Reagan Revolution, we set aside, basically Reagan came along with, Thatcher said this in 1979, there's no such thing as society, there's only a collection of individuals and families. And Reagan said it, on steroids, the only thing that matters is profit, the only thing that matters is the individual. Government is not the, he said this in his First, his, what do you call it, the opening speech that you give, his first speech right after he was inaugurated, his inaugural remarks, he said, government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. In other words, people working collectively for each other's benefit is what's wrong with American society. This was Reagan saying this. And the Republican Party has adopted that whole hog, as has American business, and as did about half the Democratic Party, although they're kind of fading away. But forgive my interrupting, Margie. You were going somewhere with that.
But even before that, we claimed to have American values, but when those values are only applied to maybe 1/3 of the population, what kind of values are there?
Yeah, good point. Good point. When it was just white men, and it still is to a large extent. But you're absolutely right. Yeah, very, very well said. Thank you very much. John in Santa Fe, Texas. Hey, John, what's up?
Yeah, hi, Tom. Just regarding quickly the degradation of values, all you have to do is talk to a government worker at IRS or SSA and see exactly how things have gone down. I mean, this guy's let the dogs out, and I think that would have happened win or lose, that he would have presented a
Well, the IRS has stopped auditing rich people because so many IRS agents have been fired because of the budget cuts that Republicans have inflicted on the IRS over the last 20 years, that they literally cannot afford the year-long period of time that it takes to audit a genuinely rich person. So now they're just auditing working-class people. It's crazy.
Yep, that'd be me after this call, probably.
Yeah, and probably $1 trillion is being left on the table because the rich are getting more and more brazen in their tax evasion schemes.
Yeah, I remember how Dukakis got slammed for trying to get some of that money back in '88.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk to you about the business with Syria. I know we don't have any diplomats in Syria, because we have no relations. But the ambassadorships, we have like 40 open ambassadorships, and the Constitution states that he shall appoint.
Right.
That's another impeachable offense. I mean, no one's talking about that, too, and I feel like that's related to Ukraine and all these other places.
If you go back and you read the debates in the Constitutional Convention, and in fact, the day was July 20, 1787, was the day that they debated the impeachment clause. And several people suggested that one of the arguments, originally it was like, okay, it's got to be a crime, treason or some other crime. And then somebody else said, no, well, what about maladministration? I mean, we've removed them from maladministration. In other words, doing a crappy job. And they decided ultimately that high crimes and misdemeanors was a phrase that didn't require actual criminal code. It simply required a high crime was misuse of high office, and the highest office in the land is the White House, is the presidency. So, John, I think, right now, I think the founders would agree with you, and right now what we're looking at is that kind of maladministration. So, well said. Thanks a lot, John, for the call. Mike in Minneapolis. Hey, Mike, thanks for listening to AM 950 KTNF. What's up?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I just wanted to, I thought, earlier on one of your calls, you said that you had thought that the Kurds had been fighting for approximately 1,000 years. Actually, kind of the key word around their fighting, or key year, was 1839. You see, Kurdistan, and there was a Kurdistan. I've had people tell me there never was a Kurdistan. No, there was, and it was up in Russia, about 900 to 1,000 miles to the north of where the Kurdish people are now. And they lost in 1839 a civil war that took 13 years against Tsarist Russia, and they were given over to the caliphate in that area at that time to be agricultural workers.
Because they were Muslim, then, they were allowed into that part of the Middle East?
Yes, they were, but they were also different from the Muslims that were there. And I'll connect with another phone call. You were mentioning the way the Middle East was carved up at the end of World War I. From that point, the discrimination in that area against the Kurdish people kind of went into hyper overdrive, and they've been the doormat of the universe down there ever since, and fighting for their very lives, and trying not to integrate too much with the other folks down there because they wanted to maintain their identity. But it's and then everybody comes along, they use the Kurdish people, and they lie to them, and then leave them hanging. And It looks like that's what Donald Trump is up to now.
Yeah, the Brits did it before and after World War I, and we did it, and we're doing it right now. And yeah, spot on. Mike, thanks for the insight. I really appreciate that. I learn something every day on this program. Ronald in Chicago, listening to WCPT. Hey, Ronald, what's up?
Good afternoon, Tom. How are you?
Good. What's on your mind?
Good. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I have a question and a comment. I'm talking about judges.
Mm-hmm.
A judge is supposed to listen to both sides of a situation, evaluate the information he's been given, and then come up with a decision, irrespective of whatever party they might be affiliated with. Am I correct?
That's the theory.
Then why in this country do we politicize judges? Why do we leave, particularly at the Supreme and Appellate Court levels, decisions left or judges selected according to what party they might be affiliated with?
Right. We shouldn't, and for at least some of the history of the United States, we didn't. But it's since the 1870s, 1880s, the court has become heavily politicized, and it's now almost purely politicized. And also, Ronald, you've got a lot of towns, counties, communities, some states where judges from the local level all the way up to state Supreme Court judges are elected, and those judicial positions now have become toys in the hands of the billionaires and the big corporations. And I think we saw that rolled out in Wisconsin last year or the year before once again.
Absolutely, I agree with that too. Then I would like to think about this for a second. Since it is that way, how come we can't change our process? It would make us a much better running country.
Well, at the federal level, you've got federal judges appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. But at the state level, it's a whole patchwork quilt of different state laws about how you become a judge in different states, and then in some cases in different cities and counties. And that's where people need to get involved locally in their political process.
Listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archive.
Because you're absolutely right, Ronald. Judges should not be advancing political agendas. They should be doing what's right under the law. And welcome back. Mike in Dayton, Ohio. Hey, Mike, what's on your mind today?
Yes, I'm calling about an interview that I read the transcript of in the Washington Post. I think it was Adam Schiff this morning was interviewed right after Sondland stonewalled and said he wouldn't appear. And I thought it was enlightening what it said about his impeachment strategy, Adam Schiff's impeachment strategy. It seems like he's saying the House can go ahead and issue articles of impeachment, and audience obstruction is not going to tie up the impeachment. It's going to tie up the trial in the Senate, which seems to me would be a way that would backfire on the Republicans. I mean, they're doing all this obstruction.
Yeah, let me lay out what I think you're saying, Mike, and you can tell me if I've got this right. That because I didn't read that interview with Schiff, but it sounds to me like what you're arguing is say Trump is withholding certain documents that might implicate him or even exonerate him, but he's just withholding the documents or he's withholding testimony from Congress. Congress can still, the House of Representatives can still go ahead and issue articles of impeachment and simply throw all that under the rubric of obstruction of justice, because an impeachment is nothing more than an indictment. It's the initial charge. But then you go into the courtroom and then you have to actually present the evidence. And when the evidence is subpoenaed, you actually have to bring forward the evidence and all that kind of stuff. And so the result of that is that they're going to have to, when they get to the Senate, they're going to have to start presenting this stuff. Is that your point?
Exactly. It's enlightening to me that what it tells me is what they're actually doing is not obstructing the impeachment. They're obstructing the Senate with exoneration, if that's where the Senate's headed.
Right.
To me, that seems like they're shooting themselves in the foot.
Well, it depends on how comprehensive and how complete it is. I think that there's a lot of truth to Roger Stone's advice to Richard Nixon that he should burn the tapes rather than turn them over to Congress. Nixon had already given Congress transcripts of what was in the tapes, but they were heavily redacted, just like Bill Barr and the Mueller report. And it wasn't until Congress got the actual tapes and that they found the smoking gun. So I'm guessing that Roger Stone, who's still advising Donald Trump, as far as we all know, is telling Trump, burn that stuff. If you've got it in a secure server, nuke it, take it out, destroy it, have your people ruin it, and don't turn anything over to the House. So if Trump's obstruction of justice continues, yes, the House will impeach him for it. I think the House is probably going to impeach him no matter what. He's committed so many obvious crimes, and this thing with Ukraine is just, beyond the pale, and we have the confession and we have the transcript. But when it gets to the Senate, that's where it's going to get real interesting. And that's where a lot of this is going to depend on how John Roberts behaves. John Roberts was, when William Rehnquist was the Chief Justice and sat as the judge presiding over the trial in the Senate of Bill Clinton, his law clerk at that time was John Roberts, who is, now the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and thus will preside over the trial in the Senate. So a lot of this is going to have to do with how Roberts rules when the prosecution essentially comes forward and says, we are still lacking evidence from the Trump administration, and whether Roberts is going to be partisan or whether he's going to be down the middle. It's going to get real interesting. Mike, that's a brilliant point. Thanks for bringing it up. I appreciate it. We'll be right back. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Welcome back. 51 minutes past the hour, and George or George O in Palmetto, Georgia.
No, it's George.
George, what's up, George?
Yeah. Well, I was listening to your program, and then I flipped over to Stephen A. Smith on ESPN, and with regard to the NBA situation, where that executive made a quote supporting the Hong Kong.
Pro-democracy to protesters.
Yeah, protestations. Yeah, I listened to Stephen A. Smith, who sided with the money side. He indicated how much money was involved and that it should have been a better way of dealing with it. And while I've always listened to him and appreciated his commentary, that bothered me as an American. And I'm saying, have we really sunk this bad? You compare it to Ukraine, and what does it say? That I asked you to do me a favor so you can get what you want. Stephen A. Smith was saying billions of dollars can be lost in the NBA because of this comment. This man, Daniel Morey, should have thought about it before he said it, and look at all that it's affected and how much money could be lost.
Yeah.
And I thought that was crass, and it was upsetting. It was disturbing. And I'm an African American, and believe me, I'm an African American who's been very active and Afrocentric. But that, to me, even though we have problems, I still say this is the best country in the world to live in because I can still have a fight.
Right. Yeah,
but
the problem...
That turned me off so much.
Yeah, I'm with you, George. The problem isn't, as apparently Stephen Smith said, and I don't watch ESPN, so I'm not sure who that is, but I get what your point. But the problem isn't that one of the NBA team owners or managers or whatever role he had said something nice about pro-democracy protesters. The problem is that the NBA got into bed with China in the first place. And this is the problem that the rest of corporate America has. They're all in bed with China.
Exactly, because the issue then was not just that the NBA was affected, but it also affects a lot of these other corporate entities who think forward and say, well, look what it could do to my income possibilities. I mean, is there a point where you say, wait a minute, this is in order to make money, this is what I have to get in bed with? They've already suppressed Google, from what I understand.
Yep. Yeah, no, it's and there's numerous large corporations, particularly the manufacturing companies, that are just totally in bed with China. And frankly, I haven't heard one peep, 2.5 years of the Trump administration, not one peep about human rights pretty much anywhere in the world. Instead, you've got Donald Trump sucking up to dictators in countries where, by coincidence, whether it's the Philippines or whether it's Turkey, where he has Trump towers, where he's making money, or Russia, where he wants to have a Trump tower, where he was planning on having a Trump tower as soon as he lost the election, and then he won, and he was like, holy cow, what do we do now? But yeah, spot on, George. It's about the principles.
Well, that doesn't surprise me. Before you go about Trump, I'm from New York. Remember, I'm 76 years old. So
you know who he is.
What you will.
Yeah, there you go.
Yes, I do.
You know who he is. George, thank you for the call. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Rudy in Atlanta, Georgia. Rudy, your thoughts?
Hey, Tom. Nice to speak to you again. Hey, let's step back and let's take politics and religion out of this discussion. How about let's just try to do what's right? And that's not, I'm not hearing that from anyone, especially, I heard there was a gentleman that said that a lot of these wealthy people are not speaking out. Well, let me tell you this. When Mother Nature does what she's going to do, if we don't straighten out, won't none of them have any...
She's already doing it, Rudy. She's already doing it. We've got refugees at our southern border from climate change in Guatemala. You got the whole Arab Spring thing is climate change. We have the Western world is now dealing with climate change refugees, and for 20 years before that, poorer countries like Bangladesh were dealing with climate change refugees. Yes, we're already there.
We have to take politics and religion out of the equation at this point in time. If we don't do what's right, Mother Nature will have the last say. Even if you go back and go back into religion, as far as what they say about what happens when we didn't do the right thing, I think we're at that point.
Yeah. This is one of those Noah moments, and we've got this little girl from Sweden who is this generation's I don't know what the biblical analog would be. Perhaps Jeremiah. The one who comes along and says, hey, people, wake up. Look at what's going on right in front of you. And if we don't do something about this, the wrath of God's going to come down on us. And, like you said, you could take God out of that equation. The wrath of nature is going to come down on us. It's even more inexorable than a Bronze Age God. So, I'm with you, Rudy. And this lack of values is the thing that troubles me, I think, the most about the Trump administration, particularly because they're promoting it to other countries around the world, and they're promoting it to our young people, that the only thing that matters is winning. The only thing that matters, and in the context of winning, the only thing that matters is getting more money. And this is a value system that Reagan brought us.
Money would not hold a stick to what's about to come down the hill if we don't do the right thing.
Yeah, amen. Well said. Rudy, thanks a lot for the call. Great to hear from you. We'll be back. We're going to continue the conversation. And let's see, don't we have a... Oh, yeah, Alex Lawson's going to drop by in the next hour and tell us about the latest piece in the war on Medicare from the Trump administration. It's going to blow your mind. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say
Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. In our book club today, our book is Border Wars, Inside Trump's Assault on Immigration by Davis and Scheer. This is from the prologue on page 5. Donald John Trump never meant for a giant wall across the entire southwest border to be the totem of his presidential campaign or the icon of his presidency. And he certainly never thought it would be the omnipresent reminder of his biggest frustrations in the White House. But it's because of all those things and the story of how it did, but it became all those things. And the story of how it did is the story of Trump's assault on immigration. Conceived of almost by accident out of political expediency and sheer marketing powers, the wall perfectly captured the us versus them spirit that animated Trump's candidacy, became a symbol of the same working class disaffection and sense of alienation that he had first tapped into by questioning Barack Obama's birthplace. For a politically inexperienced president who is untethered from any particular ideology, the wall was a centering force, an organizing principle for his promises. He would fix what was broken in the country. And what better symbol of America's problems than a deeply dysfunctional immigration system that had become a third rail of politics, too charged for either party to touch? Trump vowed to cut through all that, a Manhattan developer who would take a figurative hammer and nail to the task. In doing so, he would gleefully raise a middle finger to political correctness and to the Republican establishment that was looking for ways to appeal to Hispanic voters. And while he was at it, Trump would fan the flames of fear and insecurity by promising to wall off the United States from the threats he imagined were just across the threshold, the them who looked and sounded different from us. Was it racism, nativism, xenophobia? Trump and those who knew him best swore that it was not. But Trump's instincts clearly tended toward bigotry, the belief that foreigners were a threat and the native-born Americans were inherently more deserving. And his agenda held deep appeal to white supremacists and others who had felt shut out of politics in America for years, chastised for their views and obsessed with an agenda of racial purity. The appeal for Trump was much simpler and more basic. He was a marketing genius, a branding maven, and fear of the other, he discovered at his campaign rallies, sells like gangbusters. It worked as well in audiences in places like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, whose once thriving industrial manufacturing workers felt displaced and distraught, as it did in states on the border with Mexico that had been profoundly changed by immigration and immigrants. But as potent a campaign message as the wall became for Trump, and as strong as its gravitational pull grew after he left office or took office, it also stood as a symbol of everything that plagued his immigration policy. It reflected Trump's fixation with ideas that had political power, but were often impossible to implement. His ever-changing dictates about its dimensions and materials were the most concrete examples of the whims of a fickle and deeply insecure president who always grasped for the solution that looked toughest. He pursued the wall over the objections of the career public servants who always knew that a wall was not the solution, just as he would disregard their advice and legal counsel on so many other immigration matters. It was a one-dimensional approach to a complex problem, in large part based on his own ignorance. His determination to build the wall over the objections of Congress reflected his cavalier approach to the law, which invited court challenges at every turn. The years-long war he waged over the wall revealed a bundle of contradictions that was Trump himself, a resident of one of the most diverse cities on the planet who married 2 immigrants but was hostile to outsiders. A businessman enamored of cheap and readily available labor who pressed for cuts to legal immigration. A self-styled master negotiator who could not cut a deal with Congress on immigration to save his life. Build that wall was the incessant soundtrack of Trump's frenzied campaign rallies. But once in office, he discovered that doing so was an operational, legislative, and legal quagmire that would swallow up his political capital and leave him deeply frustrated. It was a pattern that played out on every level of Trump's immigration agenda. His Muslim ban was an early indication of how the rush to fulfill his campaign promises could sow chaos and spark court challenges. Plotted in secret because Trump's advisors were certain deep state bureaucrats would kill it in the cradle. The travel order embodied the president's approach. Propose something outrageous, divisive, and potentially illegal. Watch your political opponents lose their minds criticizing it. Ask questions and provide policy rationales later. Trump's decision to end protections for dreamers, the undocumented young immigrants who have been brought into the United States as young children, set the stage for months of fighting with Congress and revealed his conflicting instincts, a desire to be seen as compassionate even as he disparaged S-hole countries in Africa and unleashed bare-knuckled tactics on immigrants. His decision to separate migrant children, some just a few months old, from their parents at the border, pointed up profound conflicts inside his administration. Some had warned of the dire consequences of a plainly cruel tactic, while others argued that it was the only effective way to deter a horde of migrants from rushing the border. It was one of the only times that Trump retreated under pressure, unwilling to endure a backlash that included members of his own family. And a curious thing, perhaps predictable in retrospect, happened as Trump's immigration crackdown unfolded throughout the country. An actual crisis, different but no less urgent than the one he was constantly warning Americans about, began to develop and worsen at the border. Border Wars by Davis and Shear.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
My siblings and I were curled in my queen-size bed watching the television that sat in the corner of my mother's wooden vanity dresser. Moving Forward by Corinne Jean-Pierre.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to our third hour. Thom Hartmann here with you. This hour of our program, by the way, brought to you in part by XChair, THOM, xchairtom.com is their website. Also, a heads up that day after tomorrow, Thursday night at 7:30 here in Portland, if you're in the Portland area, I will be at Powell's, the main store on Burnside, giving a rant about the hidden history of the Supreme Court and the betrayal of America. And we'll get into all those details and all that kind of stuff on Thursday night. On the line with us right now, though, is our old buddy Alex Lawson, the Executive Director of Social Security Works, owner, host, producer at We Act Radio in Washington, D.C., socialsecurityworks.org, also a frequent fill-in guest for me on this program, person that we love and appreciate. Law202 is his Twitter handle. Alex, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
So, Donald Trump announced a couple days ago, and I don't think this got anywhere near enough publicity, that he was going to save Social Security, right, just in time for, save Medicare, just in time for Medicare for All to roll out. What's really going on here?
This is nothing except for Donald Trump's plan to privatize Medicare. And you are absolutely correct that with everything else going on, it barely caused a blip. But what Donald Trump is proposing is basically the exact same thing that Paul Ryan had been trying to accomplish for decades, for years and years in the House, in the Congress. So it's a real threat. And the difference is obviously that he's going to be doing most of the stuff through executive action and not through legislative changes. So it's not as permanent. But, what we know is when you break a program through executive action, it is oftentimes not possible to put it back together. And that's what he's proposing. He dresses it up in some language. He says, he's going to bring some market pricing into traditional Medicare. But this is what he's doing. He's privatizing Medicare. He wants to turn our earned benefits over to his criminal friends in the insurance industry.
And they're doing this through these privatized programs that when the Bush administration pushed this through, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the year was 2005, Medicare Part C, when they first laid this thing out, that private health insurance companies can offer insurance to people over 65 and the government will backstop them and subsidize them. They called it Medicare Advantage, which is a tragedy because it's not Medicare, it's private health insurance. I got my Medicare booklet that had the state of Oregon, all the policies that are available, all the Medicare Advantage policies, and they have annual deductibles of $3,000, $5,000, $10,000, $20,000. I mean, if you get seriously sick and you've got Medicare Advantage, you may be in a whole world of hurt. Whereas if you've got regular Medicare and a good solid Medigap policy to fill in the holes, you're doing good. But this is they're trying to expand the number of things that can be offered on the front end, the fancy, the sizzle stuff, selling the sizzle rather than the steak, whereas the steak is getting smaller and smaller, the Medicare Advantage plans and what they will pay and where their exceptions are and how they can cut you off and drill holes into your policy. Do I have that right, Alex?
That's exactly right, Tom. It's complicated. It's complicated on purpose, but what you just said is exactly right. What they're always trying to do is allow the private insurers to offer more bells and whistles, but actually to try to deny the care, the actual costly care that people think they're getting because they think that they're on Medicare, but it turns out that Medicare Advantage is actually private insurance. So there are denials. And what the reports, the Inspector General reports, the IG reports have shown is that it's wrongful denials because we know that's what private insurers do. They take our premiums and deny our care. And
that's
what
their
Medicare
business
Advantage
model.
does is exactly, it's the only way they can make money. And what Medicare Advantage does is brings that into traditional Medicare. Now, what this executive order does is even more nefarious than just, they've been trying to steer people into Medicare Advantage, the whole administration. But what they're talking about now is actually breaking up traditional Medicare. So not just making Medicare Advantage more attractive to people, they are going to do that, but actually breaking up traditional Medicare to make it less attractive to people.
How specifically?
So when they say they're bringing these market pricing or other terminology like that, what they're talking about is replacing the Medicare fee-for-service with, something that is more like private insurance, which just fundamentally changes and destroys the way that Medicare functions. And that's what this executive order.
So forgive me, Alex, I'm not as deep in the weeds on this stuff as you are, and you really know what you're talking about, and I really don't. I mean, I have broad understanding, but it sounds to me like what you're saying is that right now Medicare has basically a table of here's what we pay if you have gallbladder surgery, or here's what we pay if you're going in for to have a wart removed, or whatever it may be. Here's what we pay to have blood pressure regulated, and they can afford to pay that because they've got a budget. They know how much money they've got coming in, and this way they get to know how much money they've got going out, and they do the whole actuarial thing, and that's how Medicare stays solvent. And what Trump is coming in doing is saying, screw all that stuff. Your payment schedule, we're going to throw it out the window. We're going to make it subject to the whims of the monopolies in the hospital industry and the drug industry, and in some of the medical specialties. And Medicare is going to end up having to pay a whole lot more in a whole bunch of areas, and as a consequence, it's going to get broken. Is that what you're saying?
As usual, Tom, you are deeper in the weeds than even I, and can explain it way better. That's exactly right. What I think people should just picture is, all the times that we've been sold this, the mythical magic of the marketplace, right? Like we have a public utility and it's working fine, and then, you know, somebody gets paid off in government and all of a sudden they privatize it and they promise us that it's going to deliver savings because of competition and the magic of the marketplace. Right. And then they're going to pass those savings on to the consumers. And that never happens.
Right. And then you discover it's Enron.
Yes. Exactly. What happens is we get less and we pay more. And in the end, oftentimes it goes bust and we get nothing.
Yeah.
But some Wall Street bankers end up getting another yacht.
Yeah.
And that is what this executive order is aiming at. Now, I want to say this, Tom. We're not actually sure, like many of the things that Donald Trump says, we're not actually sure what authority he has for some of the things he said. And there are legal restrictions on Medicare Advantage. We've worked to ensure that Medicare Advantage has to provide certain things, right? Like, so they can't do all bells and whistle and no cancer care. But the way he was talking about it seemed like he was saying he was going to somehow circumvent that. And there's a lot of
so now, you know, he in other words, he blew up. The way that he blew up, or probably the major hole that he's drilling in the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, is allowing insurance companies to offer junk policies where, you know, $150 a month and you think you've got health insurance, but in fact it doesn't cover anything more than $3,000 in the hospital in any 1 year or whatever. So it sounds like what you're saying is that with Medicare Advantage, he wants to introduce junk policies into the Medicare Advantage market too.
He wants to introduce he wants to basically just let the insurers do whatever they want, and he wants to kneecap Medicare, which is, right, that's what they do over and over and over.
Oh, they've been trying to do it since Ronald Reagan said it was socialism, you know, and warned us about someday we'll look back and remember when men were free before Medicare, right? So, Alex, we just have a minute or so before we're going to hit a hard break here. John Larson's Social Security 2100 Act is moving in the House. Nafta 2.0. The big problem with Nafta 2.0 that I'm hearing from a bunch of people actually is that it's a giant sweet kiss on the lips to the drug companies. Tell us about these things.
That's right. We got to get all of the pharmaceutical provisions out of NAFTA 2.0. Everyone should be calling their members in the House and demanding that's the ask. Pharma has no place in NAFTA 2.0. With the Social Security expansion, the 2100, we're coming up on this is the last chance we have for the markup in Ways and Means. We think we're going to get it, but we need people to be demanding of their members in the House that if they're Democrats, that we get a markup of the 2100 Act in the Ways and Means Committee.
Presumably this is to stabilize Social Security so it'll be solid and solvent at least until the year 2100. And I'm guessing that has to do with lifting the cap?
It does. And it's actually not just it does make it solvent, what they actuarially call sustainable solvency, into 2100, past 2100. But it also expands benefits. So it changes the COLA to more accurately reflect the cost increases faced by seniors, people with disabilities, and it increases benefits across the board. So it's a Social Security expansion bill, wildly popular, and we're just about there at the finish line in the House. We just need that extra push from the people.
So call your member of Congress, 202-225-3121, and say, Social Security 2100 Act, please do something with it, right?
Exactly, Tom.
Okay, great. Alex Lawson, SocialSecurityWorks.org. Pile of information over there. ALaw202 on Twitter. Alex, thanks again.
Thanks, Tom.
Great talking with you. We'll be back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Back with more of the news of the day and your calls in just a moment. Stick around. And welcome back. Let's see here. Wow. Mitchell in Las Vegas. Hey, Mitchell. Thanks for waiting on hold so long. I'm well. Thanks for watching Free Speech TV, too. What's on your mind today?
Well, I just want to talk about Trump for just a minute and point out a few things that people have forgot. He pulled us out of that pollution agreement that the whole world signed on to that I thought was a chance for the whole world to come together. He weakened.
You're talking about the Paris Accords. The
Paris Accords, yes.
Right. Okay.
They pulled us out of the. He's got our government so weak with all these acting officials that we have instead of actually properly vetted officials.
Yep, he's gutting our government.
And he's also putting us straight onto a war footing that has done since day one by dividing us, dividing NATO, and insulting all of our countries, all the world's leaders, one after the other, in a way that a child wouldn't do. Talk me down off of this.
No, you're Mitchell. What you're describing is actually what's happening. What you have to keep in mind: these guys don't believe in democracy. They don't believe in the founding values of this country. The conservatives, literally from day one, I mean, from the beginning of our republic, there have been conservatives who felt that it was a dangerous thing to have too much democracy. It was a dangerous thing to have the Senate directly elected by the people, so they had the states put them in there. It was a dangerous thing to have the president even elected by the people, so they created the Electoral College. There's always been this distrust of democracy, this dynamic tension between the Jeffersons of the world, who, at least speaking on behalf of white men, were saying, everybody should have a chance to participate, and that ultimately, arguably became everybody, versus the Adams and Hamiltons of the day who said, the rabble, the mob, that's what democracy is. It's not a good thing, and, et cetera. So, Trump is simply, he's vulgar and coarse, but he's saying the exact same things that Ronald Reagan was saying, the exact same things that Richard Nixon was saying, the same exact things that George Herbert Walker Bush and George W. Bush were saying when it comes, and basically the same things that all the Republicans in the House and Senate are saying and have been saying forever. Which is, we don't trust democracy, and we're going to try and break the government. What we really want is an autocracy. We want autocrats. We want a strong president. In fact, right now, Ronald Reagan. Right now, Donald Trump is running ads on CNN and MSNBC talking about how he's a tough guy. It takes a tough guy to clean up the swamp in Washington, D.C. Well, that's an ad for autocracy, for an autocrat, for a tough guy, a strongman rule. And, there's always going to be a certain percentage of people, typically about 20%, who are called authoritarian followers because of the way that they were born or the way that they grew up, who are looking for a tough guy. They're looking for a strong leader, and Donald Trump is positioning himself as that. But I hope that the rest of us who believe in democracy, who believe that the people at the end of the day typically are right. It may take a while to get there, but if we trust in democracy, we could have that republic that Ben Franklin told Mrs. Mitchell about, if we can hang on to it. So I'm with you, Mitchell.
I have one last thought.
Yeah.
I thought our country was very great before the election.
Yeah, amen. Amen. I would say Trump has made us great, G-R-A-T-E, right? He shredded us. Mitchell, thank you for the call. We'll be right back. It's 21 minutes past the hour. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. In fact, it's a big... Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and Maine in Chicago. Hey, Maine, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. Hello?
Tom? Yeah, you're on the air.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, my thing was about how they want to decide on the rights of people. You know, this thing I've been thinking about.
You're talking about the Supreme Court cases today on LGBTQ rights?
Right. Yeah. They're deciding rights of American people. These people are born and raised right here in America, and they're discriminating against them. And I know, because I'm a black man, and I know what this discrimination is like. And for them to continue to want to discriminate against American people born here, right here in America, is unconstitutional.
Yeah. It's immoral at the very least.
Right. Well, I mean, for them to continue to want to decide if one group of people should get rights that another group of people already have, to me is unconstitutional. We should all have the same rights. I know this is really hypothetical and all that, and wanting to see America on an even keel with everything and everybody, but it's not happening. And we as a people need to continue to have politicians who come in there with people over money and not money over people. Like we have like Bernie Sanders is money over people, and the former vice president is money over people. He talks about big business before he talks about the people. Then he'll talk about the people. So to me, you have those who are talking about the people first, money second, or you have those talking about money first and people second on some of these corporate Democrats.
Yeah.
So we need to really listen and find candidates who are people orientated more so than money orientated.
Yeah, I'm with you. Well, yeah, I absolutely agree. Maine, thank you very much for that. Lori in Du Bois, Pennsylvania. Hey, Lori, what's up? Or is it Du Bois?
Hi. Good. Everything's good, thank you. A couple questions. First one has to do with some of the topics concerning impeachment. Why not just take the vote and have it go through? If you feel you have that much information and you feel that he's done something
because there's no need to
take
take the vote. Donald Trump is trying to insert this. He's trying to tell Nancy Pelosi, you've got to jump through hoops that I'm defining before I will play with you. And then you have no confidence that he'll actually do anything anyway. She has the votes. But she doesn't. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that Congress needs to vote on whether or not to investigate impeachment.
Correct. That is.
So why should Nancy Pelosi do what Donald Trump tells her to do?
It's not about what Donald Trump tells her to do. That has nothing to do with it.
That's the news media is all over this. Donald Trump said that he's not going to cooperate with Congress unless they hold a vote on whether they're having an official impeachment inquiry. There is no law that requires that. There used to, by the way, there used to be actually rules for the House of Representatives that required that back in the 70s. Those rules are gone.
That's correct.
Those rules were done away with after the Clinton impeachment. So there's no House rule that requires that. There's nothing in the Constitution that requires that, and there's no law that requires that. But Donald Trump is saying that he requires that. So why should Nancy Pelosi be dancing to his tune?
I don't think that she should be dancing to his tune, but I think in the issue of fairness and transparency, I see no reason why they shouldn't.
Okay. All right, Lori, thank you. You can call it whatever you want. I just think it's, Trump is just trying to throw another roadblock up. He's just trying to slow things down, run the clock out.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And I think he also thinks if he can get all the Democrats on record as having voted in favor of this inquiry, they can use that against them in primaries and in the elections.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Our book today is How to Get Rid of a President by David Priess. And this is from the chapter Rejected by the Party, starting on page 12, kind of mid-chapter. Presidents need not be thrown out at the polls on Election Day to find themselves dislodged from the White House. History shows us that a chief executive's own political allies can remove that incumbent when they perceive him as unpopular or unfit. Refusing to nominate a president for a second term, or better yet, getting the incumbent to realize that he should walk away before it becomes an embarrassing vote at the convention, does bring the party significant pain. But many politicians have calculated that discarding their own party's toxic president by internal action is better than waiting for the voters to do it. This dynamic remained absent for the first half century or so of American politics. George Washington, who didn't represent any formal party, set a precedent by stepping away from re-election after 2 terms. Successor after successor followed suit, keeping the support of their parties until they left office after 8 years. Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and Jackson lost the next election, both Adamses and Van Buren, or met the Grim Reaper, Harrison. John Tyler, if only in this one respect, was a trendsetter. He began a 6-president cascade of men who failed to appear on their party's ballot in the general election after their first term. One, Zachary Taylor, literally had no choice. Like Harrison, he died in office. The others, by staying alive through their 4-year terms, could have carried their party's banners again on Election Day. Not one did, as national agonizing over slavery and other tensions within each of the major parties made it difficult for any president to build and sustain a governing coalition. Of those 5 chief executives, only James Polk left with a solid reputation and a ledger of successes. He'd told Democrats upon his nomination in 1844, "I shall enter upon the discharge of the high and solemn duties of the office with the settled purpose of not being a candidate for re-election." And he stayed true to his word. It was just as well. Only 3 months after what would have been his second inauguration, he died at the age of 53. The 3 presidents who followed Polk, the forgettable series of Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan, shared 3 characteristics. First, historians routinely rank them among the nation's worst presidents. Second, and related to that, they took no responsibility for resolving the national moral failure of slavery. And third, no matter how they had attained office, they, like future presidents Chester Arthur and Lyndon Johnson, found themselves spurned by their own parties. The Whigs had learned in 1840 that a celebrity candidate seemed to have an easier route into the White House than a party regular. So in 1848, they nominated General Zachary Taylor, a recent hero of battlefields in the Mexican-American War. Despite his lack of solid political principles or any apparent passion for the job, just 2 years earlier he'd said with apparent sincerity, "I am not and never shall be an aspirant for that honor," Taylor won the election over Democratic candidate Lewis Cass. In July 1850, he became the second straight Whig general to president who couldn't make it to the next election alive. Vice President Millard Fillmore took his place. Fillmore had risen to prominence in New York's anti-Mason party dedicated to exposing and opposing Freemason fraternal organizations, but switched allegiance to the Whigs in the 1830s. In the first year and a half of the administration, inter-party rivals had manipulated Taylor better than Fillmore did, leaving him little to do but preside over the Senate and stew over his fate in a useless job. But as president, he was prepared to avenge perceived slights. Ahead of their expected dismissal, all the cabinet members whom Fillard had inherited from Taylor offered their resignations, which were quickly accepted by the new president. He asked them to remain in place for 1 month. They agreed to stay for 1 week. Fillmore would proceed to fire more previous political appointees than any of his successors had. More than half of those at the State Department, for example, had to find new jobs. The biggest development during Fillmore's presidency was the Compromise of 1850. This set of bills admitted California to the Union as a free state, allowed the organization of the Utah and New Mexico territories without reference to slavery, resolved both the Texas state boundary and the Lone Star State's remaining debt, abolished the slave trade in the District of Columbia, and reaffirmed the fugitive slave law that required the returning of slaves escaped across state lines. Fillmore signed each bill, believing this package of measures had fixed what he considered an annoying issue that kept getting in the way of his other priorities. The compromise bills delayed a war between the states, but at a cost. They not only perpetuated slavery, but split the Whigs further apart, as most Northerners refused to abide by the fugitive slave law. Congressional elections in November 1850 increased the Democratic opposition's majorities in both the House and the Senate. The rest of the president's term was so bad that the highlight might have been the start of Commodore Matthew Perry's voyage to Japan to open that country to American trade, even though he didn't arrive until Fillmore left office. Not long after rising to become the chief executive, Fillmore declared he wouldn't run again in the 1852 election. He reiterated that in 1851. But the trappings of presidential power and the pleas of his remaining party faithful convinced him to retract that pledge and make a late entry into the field of candidates. He portrayed his about-face as a noble personal sacrifice for the good of the party and the country. And during the spring of that election year, 8 Whig state conventions endorsed him. As delegates gathered for what a leading historian of the era calls the longest, most rancorous, and most debilitating Whig National Convention ever to meet, the first tally had Fillmore in the lead. How to get rid of a president. Thom Hartmann cruise will be sailing in July of 2020. The 7-day Oceania cruise will be going to Bermuda, and I'll be hosting onboard events about the topics of the day. More info at thomhartmann.com or 800-856-1155. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Welcome back. Boy, what a busy day. All these things we've been talking about. Tanner in Wisconsin says you want to disagree with me about Syria. What's on your mind, Tanner?
Yeah, well, I don't know really what your reasoning is, but it's interesting that all these people on the left are objecting to. I understand they don't like Trump, but he's trying to end a forever war, a neocon project that hasn't been approved by Congress. You know,
protecting the Kurds and kicking ISIS out of northern Syria was not a neocon. No, Tanner, stop for a second. Stop.
Protecting crap. You're just a warmonger, and you don't even know it. You don't even know it.
Would you pot Tanner down,
You don't
please?
even know it.
Thank you. Protecting the Kurds was never part of a PNAC project. You know, yeah, the Project for New American Centuries, sure, they wanted to take down Syria. It was down the road after Iraq, but no, this was about protecting the Kurds, number one. And number two, what I'm saying is not that we should be there or we should be there forever. But what we should be doing, we should be exercising leadership in the world. You know, you've got Assad, who's a bad guy who's running Syria. You've got the ISIS, who's in open conflict with us in a bunch of different places, in large part because George W. Bush and Dick Cheney did lie us into those wars. And here we are. So let's bring the rest of the world into this. Let's bring Europe into this in particular, especially since Turkey wants to stick their nose into this, and Turkey's a NATO country. Now, Tanner back up again. If you want to try, some more ad hominem attacks or, telling me whatever you think,
I don't mean look,
go
I don't
for
mean
it.
to
It just
do
makes
that.
you seem small.
No, that's not my point. But the guy called earlier and said Trump is thrashing NATO. Well, Turkey's our NATO ally, so you have to be consistent with your message. And the neocons always have an excuse. We can't leave Afghanistan because we've got to protect the women. There's always a narrative that gets floated out there, and I'm surprised you fall for it.
I agree with you by and large, but I do think that the Kurds, that what Erdogan wants to, first of all, I don't think Erdogan should have, since Erdogan has declared essentially a military dictatorship in Turkey, I don't think they should be part of NATO anymore. And
that's a different discussion. We should have that discussion.
Well, Erdogan is on the verge of committing genocide. He wants to kill a couple 100,000 families. The Kurds are in that region not because a whole bunch of Kurdish fighters walked in there with guns, but because they've been living there for 1,000 years or hundreds of years.
Yeah, the Kurds are not innocent, though, completely.
Of course they're not. Nobody in the Middle East is, Tanner. Nobody is. We're not innocent completely.
That's why it's time to get back. Yes, we are not.
I'm all in favor of getting out of there. But let's get out of there in a way that is smart. Let's get out of there in a way that doesn't lead to, you got 90,000 ISIS fighters that are being held in 5 camps right now. 4 of those 5 camps are controlled by the Kurds. And the Kurds are saying, okay, if we are going to have to leave, if we're going to have to go up and defend ourselves from the Turkish invaders on the northern border, we're just going to walk away from the camps. And what are those 90,000 ISIS fighters going to do? They're going to go back and... Go ahead.
You're making my point. That's why we shouldn't be there at all. Time to go home. Enough excuses. If you want to go to the Middle East,
if we could collectively, Tanner, I'm as opposed as you are to the United States being involved in these wars. I was opposed to Vietnam. I was opposed to Iraq. I was opposed to Afghanistan. I'm one of the few people on the left who was opposed to Afghanistan. You'll recall, and I continue to be. We were lied into all of these wars. I'm totally with you. But when you get out, it's just the civil, reasonable, decent thing to do to get out in a way that doesn't set up a genocide. And right now, Erdogan is behaving toward northern Syria, toward the Kurds, because he's got his own Kurdish problem in southern Turkey. Erdogan is behaving toward them the way that Hitler was behaving toward Poland. And somebody back in 1939, or 37, I guess was the year, was it 37, 39, whatever the year was that Hitler invaded Poland, should have said, wait a minute, that's the line you don't cross. And it should have been a multilateral action. And the same thing here. I think that we need to do this collectively. You have the last word, Tanner.
Well, so 7 years from now, we can't get out of there. They're going to float the same excuse.
No, I think if this,
we've been in Afghanistan for 18 years.
I think if this was negotiated well, if this was negotiated in good faith, if we brought in our European allies, if we cleaned up NATO and got Turkey out of it, and because Turkey is the malefactor here, but Donald Trump owns 2 Trump Towers in Istanbul, and he's making $5 million a year off Turkey. And Erdogan calls him up and threatens that, and all of a sudden he starts jumping. And I don't think that's how our foreign policy should be operating. That's my point.
I don't think I think we should stay consistent, and Trump has nothing to do with it. If he does something good, we should encourage it and take advantage. It's just...
Okay, I get it.
The opposite of Trump thing is a bad idea.
Okay, we've both had our say here, Tanner. Thanks for the call. Frank in Woodland, California. Hey, Frank, what's up?
Pretty good. How you doing, Tom? And from my POV, looking down at the Trump Barr thing, I kind of see this guy, or these guys, if you will. Remember the movie A Few Good Men, Jack Nicholson? And remember?
Yes, I did it. Damn it, I'll do it again. Yes.
Right. You guys don't want the truth. That's the entitlement that these guys, you move up. I mean, as you say, the white single straight guys, the more they move up in entitlement, the more they feel godlike. And these guys are feeling, Barr and Trump are feeling as though, and this is speculation, by the way, of course, they're like, we know it's good for you, even if we don't think it's breaking law, because we know it's better. It's like,
no, finish your thought, and then I got something to toss in.
It's the fraternal concept of that whole thing. So, go ahead.
Well, I think the one crack in that wall that appeared about 3 or 4 hours ago was the Department of Justice just announced that they are going to turn over an unredacted copy of the Mueller report to Congress, to the House Intelligence Committee, and which had been subpoenaed. And up to this point, nobody in the House has seen the unredacted copy, and so we don't know. I mean, I guarantee you, there's some real. It's going to be a little shop of horrors, right? So it could be that Bill Barr is looking back at what happened to John Mitchell back in the 70s, and going, I really don't want to spend 19 months in jail like John Mitchell did, who was, Nixon's attorney general, and was playing these same kind of tricks. But we'll see.
Spot on.
We'll see. Yeah.
One last utterance here. By the way, I don't call these guys Trumpettes or Trumpers or whatever, because they've regressed in their evolution. So I call them Trumpladites.
Trumpladites. Okay, I love it. Frank, thanks a lot for the call. That's a good one. Well said. Mary in Chicago. Hey, Mary, what's up?
Hello, I'm Mary Bennett, and I am an officer with AFSCME retirees.
Good on you.
In the northern Chicago area.
Mm-hmm.
I've been involved in the political process as a volunteer since 1972.
Wow.
And
Good on
from
you.
what I could see of our president's behavior, he makes Richard Nixon look like a saint.
I agree.
I have never, in all my life, just being an observer in all of this, seen the level of corruption that I've seen in this administration.
Yep.
Going back to the time in which, Manafort went to the and appealed to the delegates of the Republican National Committee to actually change the revision as it, regard to our present difficulties, over there. I think it goes back then. It goes back to the time that that he did not release his tax returns. I think the corruption is invisible in plain sight right now.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Mary, and I think you've hit that nail right on the head. Sorry about the cliche, but absolutely. And this lack of values, this lack of principle, this lack of respect for the rule of law is infectious, and it is infecting our country. Mary, thank you so much for the call. Tim in Hendersonville, North Carolina. Hey, Tim, what's up?
Hey, how you doing?
Good.
Kind of building on the last caller, I want to talk about civility. I mean, civility is really just an exercise in the honor system. And, why should the average person go to court? Why should the average person follow up on a subpoena or a bench warrant or a warrant? I mean, when our elected government representatives won't do it,
right.
What kind of example are you setting for the regular people? You want civil unrest? Everybody across the United States should just say, hey, you know what? We're going to act like our Republican leaders are obstructionists. By the way, they obstructed for 8 years during the Obama administration. And because the House was lost, see, we have three branches of government. You take any two, and they can outdo all three.
Yep.
So you got the Senate and the presidency now obstructing anything else that the House can do.
And not to mention packing the courts with right-wing wackadoodles, which is why they're trying to throw everything into the courts, because they keep hoping they'll get one of their judges.
Absolutely. And one other thing about gun control. Back in the 60s, a certain Ronald Reagan was one of the first people in charge to ever implement gun control.
Yeah, the Mumford Act when he was governor, when Bobby Seale and Huey Newton showed up at the Capitol building in California,
Panthers, man.
with a couple of guns, and Reagan was out there saying hi to a group of little kids, and Reagan was like, "Oh my God, look at these people with guns!" And within what, a week, 2 weeks, something like that, Congressman Mumford had that law banning open carry in California, and boom, right through the legislature.
So I want to start an organization, a nonprofit called AMMO, AMMO. Shoot.
Go for it. You got a few more seconds here, Tim.
Called the American Minority Militia Organization. I want to make every person of color have an AR-7, an AR-15, an M16.
Oh God!
I encourage them to buy. You want to see gun control happen? You just wait till the blacks and the browns start getting out there and showing their guns.
You may be right. Tim, thank you for the call.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archive.
I mean, we certainly saw that example with Reagan and the Black Panthers, but on the other hand, fighting fire with fire, fighting guns with guns, I don't think is a good idea. We'll be back. And welcome back. Let's see here. Jim in Turlock, California. Hey, Jim, what's on your mind today?
Well, hi, Tom. Just a little tongue-in-cheek levity on a day of serious political conversations. On which side of the wall and moat do you think Trump would like to put the alligators and the snakes, Mexico's or ours?
Okay, I got it.
Just one more tiny thing. I've heard Roosevelt's speech about we have nothing to fear but fear itself all my life. Never quite understood what he meant there. But now that we've got Trump spreading hate and fear around, I know what he's talking about. So that's all I have. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Good to hear from you. That was 1933. That was his inaugural address, Franklin Roosevelt, where he said we have nothing to fear but fear itself. And he wasn't talking about the war. People think he was talking about World War II. This was almost a decade before World War II. This was at the depths of the Great Depression. And he was saying to Americans, we don't need to be in despair. Despair is not an option. That we need to come up with plans, and we need to move forward and implement those plans. And we will get out of this. We're Americans. We know how to do this kind of stuff. We've done it before. We've been through hard times before. We're going to get through this one. And he rallied the country, and it was a wonderful thing. Bart in Bellevue, Washington, listening to KBCS. Hey, Bart, what's up?
Hey, Tom. Oh, I'm calling from Bellevue. That's right. Where in the last hour, we had rain, sleet, snow, and I think in the far distance I see locusts coming. I don't know. But but in any case, I'd like to make two quick salient points, if I may.
Sure.
I'd like to respectfully submit to you and our listeners that the definitions of that schlump in the White House is that, number one, he's inept.
Yes.
And look up the definition of that. You'll see what it is.
Well, just look at his business career. It's obvious, yeah.
I'm sorry?
I said, look at his business career. He's had more failures than successes, and the successes
he's running the government like he's running his business.
Right.
But and the second one, just as bad, he's basically evil incarnate. Right. And if you look up that definition, it'll definitely sum up who he is.
That's probably debatable, but that part of that debate is around what is the definition of evil. But if you go with Hannah Arendt's the banality of evil, that's the most dangerous evil is just the kind of routine. The guys who were keeping the trains running when they were filled with Jews, that kind of evil. I'm sorry.
And last but not least, I was going to pick up on the comments that were made about Mother Nature, and one of the major components that was left out of the argument, that when you were discussing all these skirmishes that we had over the last millennia, that people are going to come now and start making up for all that lost time. The one component that was left out is Mother Nature. Yep. Mother Nature is going to take care of her children in the wrong way if they don't take care of her,
Yeah, we're going to get a spanking. Well, we're getting it, actually, right now.
Yeah, that's it. And last but not least, my main problem with Trump, besides other main problems, is that he has no connection to the arts.
Right.
He has no connection one way or the arts. Never had anything at the White House. Never. He snubs the Kennedy Center.
Other than paintings of himself. He has no connection to the arts. He has no connection to humor. He never smiles. He doesn't laugh. He has no connection to pets or animals. He brags about the fact that he never changed a diaper. He doesn't like kids. I mean, there's something seriously wrong with this guy. Bart, thanks for putting your finger on it. We'll be right back. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Members only. Welcome back. We're talking about all the news of the day and it's like drinking out of a fire hose today. In Abbeville, Georgia, Lola. Hey, Lola, what's up?
Hey, Lola. Tom, it's me, Lola. Yeah. I just wanted to touch on the fact that knowledge is power.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the abuses in the world are learned in the home, in dysfunctional families, where, it's like Joseph and his brothers and, the deal that I'm talking about, psychologically speaking. You're taught in your home that there's one that isn't as good as the other. When your mom and dad aren't of the same mindset, and somebody has to dump on somebody.
Well, apparently both of Trump's parents dumped on Trump. I mean, his father didn't like him. He thought he was a loser. They couldn't handle him. They finally sent him off to military school when he was before he was even a teenager. And then when he came home in the summer, his mother, all by herself, went off to Scotland. And
because they say when kids are like by the age of 5 or 8 or whatever, they identify with the successful parent who usually is the abuser.
That was his dad.
Rare love. And it's just a whole society and world run by bullies, Putin and Un and, the dictators. And
and Trump is embracing them all.
Because birds of a feather, you know.
I agree.
But until we get into schools or something, I don't believe in the government going up in your homes. But they're locking up our men, they're locking up our boys to create a dysfunctional society that they can capitalize on.
And they're making money locking people up on top of that. Now they're locking up children like crazy. I mean, it's nuts. Lola, thank you so much for your contribution. I appreciate, for what you said on the air. Brilliant. Matt in Somerville, South Carolina. Hey, Matt, what's on your mind?
Oh, yes, sir. I'd just like to say that we should have known that this man wasn't a patriot. Had they treated him like they treated Muhammad Ali when he was drafted in 1965, then maybe he would answer the subpoenas. But I think his objective right now is to be a real billionaire by the time he leaves office, because every weapon sale that is sold, he gets a cut.
I think you're right. And by the way, you'll recall when he was in the primary, he said, I'm going to be the first. If I win, I'm going to be the first guy ever to make money on the presidency.
That's right. And he's actually doing it right before our eyes. And he continually tries to promote the fact that he's a patriot. If he was a patriot, we could have used his help in Vietnam. I left half of my kneecap over there.
Oh, my. Yeah. And Cadet Bone Spurs didn't even show up. Matt, thank you for the call. Thank you very much. And thanks for sharing your story. George in Livingston, Texas. Hey, George, what's on your mind?
Oh, I was just going to say that what's happened is that we still have kids in cages here in Texas.
Yeah, 20,000 of them across the country right now.
That's right. And we still have people needing Medicare. The other day I passed under a freeway in Houston, and there was people living under the bridge in tents.
Yes.
That shouldn't happen.
No.
And yet, the conversation we're having today is all about Trump. He's very brilliant. He's a scoundrel. He's terrible. He's got to get out of office.
Yeah, he's a con man. He's a grifter. He's very smart as a grifter. He knows what he's doing. He knows how to do it. He's been doing it his whole entire life. George, thank you for the call. Boy, what a day. Just a heads up again, Minneapolis, Trump is going to sue them because they want him to pay up front for security, because 9 or 10 cities now have sent him bills for security that he'd promised to pay, and he's not paying it. The guy is a grifter, and all the Republicans around him are in on the grift. Anyhow, we'll continue tomorrow. In the meantime, don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It actually requires you. Really, it does. So get out there, get active, tag you're it. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a great afternoon.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.